Lo hemos debatido, repito, esta es la cuarta reunión en la que se va a topar este tema. Entonces pensamos que, y como fue el acuerdo en la reunión pasada, no va a haber mucho debate que darle, es decir, la mayoría de los estados ya tiene sus posiciones fijas, asentadas en este contexto, y procuraríamos que se lleve a cabo de la manera más rápida posible. Obviamente se explicarán cuáles son las propuestas que existen, etcétera. Si algún estado quiere comentar algo, siempre y cuando sea concreto, pues el debate, como ya lo dije, ha sido prácticamente agotado, se lo haría. Yo sí pediría también al comité que se acoja a esta propuesta de Brasil y que se cambie el orden en el que se van a llevar a cabo los puntos del día de mañana. Voy a repetir, iniciaríamos con la consideración y adopción del proyecto del programa de trabajo del comité para el 2014 y 2015 y luego iríamos a la propuesta de enmienda del artículo 4 del reglamento y a la elección de presidente y vicepresidente. No nos tomaría mucho tiempo esto y luego ya continuaríamos con la revisión final y la aprobación de los informes. Si es que estamos de acuerdo, quisiera saber si es que hay algún estado que no esté de acuerdo más bien y para poder realizar este cambio. Dejo la mesa abierta. No hay objeción, entonces estaríamos de acuerdo en realizar este cambio en la agenda. Muchas gracias, Brasil, por la propuesta. Y continuaríamos en este momento entonces con el punto 4 de la agenda, que es la consideración de los temas de interés colectivo. Vamos a iniciar entonces con la responsabilidad del sector privado en la prevención y el combate contra la corrupción. La primera presentación que tenemos es de la vicepresidenta del Advocacy and Stakeholder Engagement Center for Responsible Enterprise and Trade, que es CREATE. Leslie Benton, a quien invitamos a pasar aquí a la mesa para que pueda realizar su presentación. Invitamos entonces a nuestros tres expositores a sentarse aquí, por favor. Iniciaríamos con Leslie Benton.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today to introduce you to my organization, the Center for Responsible Enterprise and Trade, or CREATE for short, and how we work with the private sector to reduce corruption. So since I'm going first, I'll start with a little context setting. Corruption poses significant legal, financial, and reputational risks for any company doing business anywhere in the world today. In the last decade, we have seen corruption scandals erode confidence in business among investors, consumers, their own employees, and other stakeholders. Companies who have been caught in corruption's net have paid millions in fines and other penalties, and executives have faced jail time. And in the U.S., this trend toward individual prosecutions certainly doesn't seem to be receding in any way. During the same time, we have seen the emergence of a truly global legal regime. Most countries have now adopted anti-corruption laws pursuant to their obligations under the Inter-American Convention Against Corruption, the OECD Convention, and the UN Convention Against Corruption. At this point, any company operating internationally must pay close attention not just to their home country anti-corruption laws and to far-reaching laws such as the US FCPA, the UK Bribery Act, and now the Brazil Clean Company Law, but to those of every market in which they operate. And of course, the work of this body has been at the forefront of these efforts to create a harmonized legal regime. And although enforcement is still inconsistent across countries, we are beginning to see movement. Increasingly, countries are working together, sharing information, and taking a coordinated approach to enforcement. This is important to leveling the playing field for ethical companies operating everywhere. And this, of course, is happening at a time of unprecedented globalization of industries and markets, and a trend toward less distant, low-cost country sourcing and more regional manufacturing and value chain strategies, which means companies have business partners, sometimes numbering in the thousands, all over the globe. In reaction to these forces, companies operating globally have increased their focus on corruption prevention, and many have made significant investment in programs to ensure they are complying with anti-corruption laws and operating with integrity. These efforts are crucial if the private sector is to have an impact on corruption. While effective government regulation will continue to be vital to reform, government scope and reach only go so far, and we believe the private sector can and must play a more active role in driving responsible business practices, not only in their own organizations, but throughout global supply chains. CREATE, my organization, was launched in 2011 with the mission of helping companies improve their ability to address corruption. We're a global nonprofit, and we realize that companies that develop effective anti-corruption programs can avoid the harms I mentioned before, the costly litigation, the fines, the penalties, the reputational harm, while at the same time enhancing their positions as ethical players in global markets. But they shouldn't stop there, and this is really the reason for CREATE's it's really the genesis of CREATE. By taking a lead and working with their business partners, sharing with others the anti-corruption practices that they have developed, companies have an opportunity to embed responsible business practices within their value chains, thus helping to foster a culture of compliance that benefits everyone. We work with the private sector in a variety of different forms. We've developed a service called Create Leading Practices that companies can use to assess their compliance programs internally, identify gaps, and then improve over time. Some of the companies that we're working with use the service to assess their own internal programs. Others use it, as I said earlier, as a means of training their business partners on how to develop and implement strong programs to prevent, detect, and remediate corruption. Post-assessment, we engage in training and capacity building. And of course, we're engaged in public education and awareness raising through publication of thought leadership and tools for companies, public speaking, and engaging with other like-minded organizations. Currently, one of the projects that we're actually involved in is with the International Organization for Standardization, or ISO, Anti-Bribery Management Systems Standard Setting Process. That's sort of a mouthful. Our goal is to make this standard strong and effective so that it raises the bar for compliance for companies everywhere. Work is already underway. We've had several international meetings. We have another one next week. We expect the standard to be available for comment in 2015 and the final standard to be available in 2016. And I think it's important to note here that there are 26 companies who are participating as members of the committee, the ISO committee working on the standard. There are another 13 that are acting as observers along with other international organizations like the OECD, Transparency International, and others. And in the Americas region, we have Canada, Colombia, Mexico, the US, Argentina, and Ecuador participating in that process. That is, delegations from those countries participating in that process. Since our founding, we have engaged with a diverse range of companies around the world, including in the US, the UK, Germany, France, China, Japan, India, Mexico, and Brazil, just to name a few. And we've heard repeatedly about the significance of and challenge posed by corruption. Last year, to better understand how companies are managing this difficult issue, we worked with the Conference Board, which is a large research organization, to survey general counsels, compliance officers, and supply chain representatives of companies to sort of understand how they're managing the issue. The companies that were part of our work were actually very large global companies. And from this study, a few key findings emerged, and I thought it might be interesting to present those to you today. First, respondents noted that there was significant corruption risk throughout their value chains, particularly with their agents. we weren't surprised. Second, understanding whether a compliance program is effective is a challenge. Most of the executives, at least half of the executives that we surveyed, told us that they really didn't know if their compliance programs worked before a problem occurred. So that was a problem. Third, effective training, they all agreed, was vital to anti-corruption compliance, although today the focus is really only on training their own employees rather than requiring training of or making training available to agents or other business partners. And this really seemed to us like a misalignment of risk and resource when they've told us earlier that their biggest risk is with their agents and business partners, and yet they're doing absolutely no collaboration with them to help them understand what the anti-corruption requirements are and how to comply with them. This seemed to us to be a gap that really needed to be filled. And what has been most evident from the Conference Board survey and research is the need for companies to be proactive and put effective compliance programs in place before a problem occurs and to use their commercial leverage to encourage their partners to do so as well. And I really say encourage because what we have found is that the sort of audit approach that companies have used in the past really doesn't work. And so what we are calling for companies to do is take much more of a collaborative, capacity building approach to cascade responsible business practices through supply chains. You know, this is a form of collective action, but it's one way in which the private sector can really take responsibility for making a difference on the ground in the markets where they work. We followed up the Conference Board survey with a pilot of our own service, Create Leading Practices, which I mentioned earlier. And there, the companies that we were working with were more medium-sized, not really small, but more medium-sized, although they all were operating globally. And the top 3 findings of our program assessments were very similar to the findings of the Conference Board survey, which we found interesting that, you know, companies of any size working in any market are really facing the same kinds of problems. Most companies that we assessed had adopted anti-compliance policies, which really wasn't a surprise to us because there are such good international guidelines that companies can use today to develop their own policies or their own compliance programs, such as the TI Business Principles or the model policies that have come out of the World Economic Forum Partnering Against Corruption Initiative, even to the kinds of guidance that we see coming out of the U.S. Justice Department, the SEC, the UK Ministry of Justice, and so on. But what we found, which was really disturbing, was that even in companies with good programs, implementation was often very weak. Among our pilot companies, and it was a small sample, it was 25 companies, 80% of them did not have specific procedures in place for companies to follow the policies. And that was a huge disconnect as well. So they had great policies, but their employees didn't really know how to follow them. So again, identifying a gap that we can fill. We found that more than half of the companies, 65%, did not perform any kind of anti-corruption risk assessment before entering into a new transaction, for example, instead relying on the common sense and experience of their employees to know when a corruption risk might arise. This also led to program gaps. If you don't really understand what your risks are, you can't develop an effective program to meet them. And again, in terms of training, 60% said they did not specifically train even their own employees. And a full, 90 to 100% said they didn't do any kind of training or capacity building with their third parties. And again, this lack of training was directly tied to the low level of implementation that we found, because again, employees didn't necessarily understand what the risks were, what the red flags for corruption were, and how to meet those issues as they arose. And finally, again, in terms of monitoring, roughly 60% did not monitor their own compliance programs, so they didn't check to see if they were working, and a full 90% didn't monitor the compliance of their business partners. So again, these companies, like the large companies from the Conference Board survey, had no way really to know if their programs worked until something went wrong. So the good news is we are now working with those companies to help them improve their programs and fill gaps that were identified during the assessment process. We take companies through an improvement project and process that includes guidance, e-learning, workshops, and other types of training and technical assistance. And a large part of what we were doing is trying to help companies find a scalable way to work with their business partners. You know, we have found companies who really want to do that, but find it to be so very difficult because of the factors that I mentioned earlier, that they have these value chains that span the globe. Often their business partners are in remote locations. It's very costly. So we're trying to help them find ways to sort of meet those obstacles to training. You know, we've been incredibly rewarded to receive, you know, positive feedback on our approach. You know, we see companies really wanting to do this. And in terms of the third parties that we're working with, so the business partners of the larger firms, they also want to find ways to improve. And it's interesting to see not only enforcement being a driver for good business practices, but sort of the commercial leverage that business partners can bring to the table as well. So we, you know, in closing, we believe that responsible business practices are vital to a thriving global economy, and corruption prevention is a responsibility not only for governments but for companies. It's about creating the incentives, and that's what governments do through enforcement, but also driving appropriate behavior through the capacity building and tools development that the private sector can do for itself. And while each company's first priority is and should be to ensure that its own operations are free of corruption, companies have a shared interest in creating a culture of compliance throughout their value chains. And by working together, collectively, we can level the playing field for all and help to provide the necessary conditions for a fair and sustainable global business environment. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias a Leslie Benton. Vamos a tener 3 presentaciones, es decir, ya vamos a la primera, 2 más que son acerca del mismo tema y luego realizaremos las preguntas respectivas a los 3 ponentes. Dicho eso, doy paso a Gonzalo Guzmán. Él es, tengo todo en inglés, él es el Head of Legal Projects, experto en proyectos legales, está aquí, International Bar Association. Por favor. Gracias.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Just going to the presentation in English. I'm actually from Colombia, but this was prepared in English. So for the sake of those that speak in English, I will just do it in English. So thanks a lot, I think. I see some familiar faces here. Although I work for the International Bar Association, which is the largest legal organization in the world that groups lawyers, bar associations, and different law firms. I'm here just really talking on behalf of the 3 organizations that you see that are part of this joint project, the OECD, UNODC, and the IBA. I guess there's no need for introducing the other 2 organizations. What perhaps is important just to introduce a matter of background is how we came to launch together the 3 organizations, a collective action group that it was for lawyers. I guess many say, well, probably there are some other sectors that are probably riskier and they need a little bit more of attention. But because of our interest in the profession and raising the standards of the profession, and the fact that it was evident for more and more companies and your governments as well, that lawyers were one of those type of intermediaries of international business transactions that deserved an action from the organizations. So we just saw in the previous presentation the importance and the concern that exists among companies about the agents. And definitely legal professionals, especially when they're practitioners, when they're representing companies, when they're opening investments, when they're lobbying before their governments, they're agents. And this is something that has been a little bit difficult for companies just to get to, but especially particularly difficult for lawyers to understand that they don't gravitate in a bubble above the value chain of the clients, but actually they are part of the value chain systems. So 5 years ago, we decided to put together this anti-corruption strategy for the legal profession. That was going to be a long-term initiative, doesn't have a deadline, and it was going to be sort of an umbrella project. That means that there were going to be different pillars and different actions that we're going to take. Reports, workshops, events, and just let me start with something. And I'm not going to go through the statistics because you can see them there. Probably you're going to get the presentation if you haven't got it yet. But when we launch a survey where we ask around 700 of the best business lawyers in the world about awareness of the conventions, of their internal legislation, and also the perceptions that they have of corruption in the sector, the results, I wouldn't say that they were surprising, but I think they were shocking. I think over 70% of them in total, they were thinking that there was some issues of corruption among legal professionals in their jurisdiction. Of course, this changed from region to region, from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But in our case, in the Americas, particularly in Latin America, this was particularly bad. The perception that the colleagues have about the others is quite bad. And also, the awareness of the existence of the convention. I mean, you were asking the lawyers in each of your countries, do you know if your country is a signatory of the Inter-American Convention Against Corruption? And I think only like 35% of them acknowledged that that's a convention that applied to their countries. So imagine, these are the lawyers that are advising businesses around the world. So we wanted a strategy, we wanted to launch a strategy where we were going to close that gap. And we decided to launch it in Latin America. And back in 2010, we launched a pilot project where we were going to go to Brazil, sorry, not Brazil, Brazil was in the second stage. It was Argentina, Chile, Peru, Colombia, and Mexico, and train a seed of lawyers, those mainly involved in international business transactions, holding hands with their bar associations, with some of the leading law schools. And that's why I have met a few of you when we have gone to or some of your predecessors or colleagues as well. And this has been in an environment like this where we have actually come with the OECD, with UNODC, explain international framework against corruption, the risk that exists from lawyers, and just some compliance steps. To date, we have covered most of the Americas, I guess, with different events, with different awareness-raising activities, but particularly the workshops. I think the only 3 countries in South America that are left, well, we have a few more with the Guyanas and Suriname, but it's Paraguay and Bolivia and Ecuador. And Paraguay and Bolivia are going to take the next steps in November, and they're going to host these compliance workshops for legal professionals. So as you can see, we have done a lot in the continent. Probably some of you don't know that we have done this, but we want to change the business environment directly coming from these organizations. And we realized that this was not so much about the legislation, not so much about conventions. There is a market condition. Clients, major multinationals, are starting to realize, as it was proved in a report that we launched last year, that it's there, that they're doing more due diligence on lawyers. They're asking them to produce more anti-corruption policies, gifts and hospitality policies, to include an anti-corruption clause in their retainer letters, and this really is taking by surprise the profession. Luckily, we have gone through these workshops and raising awareness, but I mean, if any of you are lawyers and then you have had the opportunity of working in a law firm, you will realize that these are not staple documents that will exist in every law firm. So we are working with the clients. We're working on education. We have launched different projects on education, and we're about to launch a major project that is not about a seminar. I think a lot of people are just concentrating on seminars, but we're going to make a major, I like to call it revolution. I think that's perhaps too much, but we're gonna work together with entire faculties of law school to transform the way people are thought on corruption from day one. So, just to give you an example, not to leave it until a seminar anti-corruption, but if you are taking a lesson of public international law, that professor of that subject is going to make sure that when he's talking about formation of treaties, for instance, he's going to give you the example of the conventions. When the antitrust and competition law professor is talking about different forms of anti-competitive behavior, he will talk about collusion, and then he will just relate this to private corruption, etc., etc. And procedural law, we will talk about extraterritoriality. So it's a commitment of this. We are launching in different countries. We have been in contact with a few of the countries that are around the table. And we're doing some brainstorming meetings next week in Africa as well about how to launch this. Then we have created anti-corruption guidance for bar associations. So we are making the legal profession responsible for their own destiny in this. They need to take actions, and then bar associations should take some action here. Of course, I mean, as probably you know, in many of our countries, unfortunately, we don't have compulsory bar. And in some other countries, there's competition about different bars. But still, this is a call for all different associations of lawyers to work together in raising awareness of this. We have launched a website. You can find more information in the website. There is here behind. And just final call for why this is relevant as well in this scenario. 3 years ago, we decided to do something else with the legal professionals, a little bit meaningful for organizations and evaluation mechanisms like this. And then the OECD decided to take the step of having a meeting with legal professionals in every country that they visit as part of the assessment of the implementation of the Anti-Bribery Convention. Last year in the UNCAC COSP, I also presented the idea of starting doing it as well with the UNCAC reviews. Of course, there is a little bit different the way the UNCAC review works, and this is an opportunity as well for the MESISIC and for the OAS to promote that. Just to give you an example, in the Czech Republic, when the OECD went to visit, they couldn't have any conversations with the business sector, different reasons. And they had a conversation with the legal professionals there, and then we received a letter from the OECD saying, thank you very much. Actually, the views that the legal professionals gave us were not only from the perspective of lawyers, but they were just echoing as well what their clients were saying and the concerns as well. And they had like some criteria about implementation and perhaps better practices about enforcement. So we are good people to take into consideration in these opportunities. Also, we want to have an active profession. We want that the profession is participating in consultations in reforms of the legislation, as it has happened in a few of the countries as well around the table. And we are preparing for them to participate. Also because I think there is a two-way system as well, in the way when you establish a dialogue with the legal professionals in your country, you're establishing a dialogue as well with the private sector. And this is just to almost reiterate the previous idea. I mean, you are talking to many clients, perhaps, when you're making it very clear about the policies and the importance of the topic. And also because anti-corruption standards are going to be raised in the region. That's a plan that we have. There are other world organizations that are joining that initiative, and I'm sure that you're going to hear more about this. So I think that's everything. Thank you very much for the invitation, and open to questions at the end of the round of presentations. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias a Gonzalo Guzmán. Pasamos entonces a nuestra tercera presentación. Michael Hirschman es presidente y CEO de Fairfax Group.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to speak before you today. I don't have a PowerPoint, so I'm afraid you'll have to suffer through my discussion without any pictures. For the sake of transparency, I'd like you all to know that I'm here today wearing several hats. One as a founder of Transparency International, and the other as a corporate executive heading a company called the Fairfax Group, which is a global consultancy company. So my remarks today really are both as an NGO representative as well as a corporate leader. You probably all know, are familiar with Transparency International and know that Transparency International for years now has taken the lead in advocating greater accountability, greater integrity on the part of corporations involved in international trade. Its landmark publication, Business Principles for Countering Bribery, which is available on the Transparency International website, is seen by some in corporations as the Bible for those who want to adhere to international best practices. This publication addresses issues ranging from conflicts of interest and facilitation payments to third-party due diligence. Countless corporations around the world have depended on this publication for advice and guidance. Transparency International also has a similar publication that is put out for small and medium-sized enterprises because they face some special challenges in putting together compliance and governance programs, given that many small and medium-sized businesses have limited resources, can't necessarily afford, like large multinationals can, a large group of lawyers and a complex compliance officer organization. They can't simply afford to fund that sort of operation. But I also should point out that many of our 100 chapters around the world have programs that influence and benefit corporations in determining their behavior. For example, our chapter in the United Kingdom has a special project on defense procurement, which helps corporations dealing in that industry, in that sector, to make sure that their business practices and standards are at the highest level. Transparency International also has been very supportive of collective action programs like PACI, the Partnership Against Corruption Initiative, and ET, the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, all of which, again, are established to help corporations reach a consensus about standard practices around the world and what represents good behavior and what doesn't. Here in the United States, I serve on the board of directors of TI USA, our chapter here in Washington, D.C., and we hold regular meetings, kind of off-the-record meetings, with corporate counsels from corporations throughout the Western Hemisphere, where we discuss issues, sensitive issues to them, risk assessment-related issues, issues relating to specific problems they may have in countries throughout the world, whether that be in Latin America or Asia, the Middle East or Africa. We also have produced a study just recently, this is kind of hot off the press, a study by TI USA, which is on our website as well, and it's called Verification of Anti-Corruption Programs, Compliance Programs. And this is a particularly important study because while in the past few decades, there's been substantial progress by companies in developing and implementing compliance programs, there's been very little work done in verifying or assessing a company's program. It leaves the leadership in companies to wonder just how their program compares, how effective, how efficient is their program against others that have similar compliance and governance programs. Look, a lot of people ask me the question when I say we've come a long way today in global business in terms of corporations doing a better job internally promoting transparency and accountability. A lot of people ask me why I think that is. The short answer is I don't know. I don't know whether it's because of the rules and regulations that have been promulgated over the last 10 to 15 years, greater enforcement, greater oversight, by regulatory authorities. I mean, we only have to look at the U.S. Justice Department to realize how many cases that have been brought under the FCPA. We only have to look at the UK Bribery Act, the Serious Fraud Office, to see how many cases now are under investigation there. Recent cases in Canada, in Japan, to realize that pressure is on companies worldwide to obey the conventions, whether it be your convention, in Latin America, whether it be the OECD Convention, whether it be the United Nations Convention, whether it be the UK Bribery Act, whether it be the FCPA, or many, many other regional conventions and treaties and agreements that are in existence today. I wish I could come before you today and say, rather than being a believer in good governance and good compliance, that corporations are stimulated more by rules and regulations and prosecutions than the simple philosophy that this is the right thing to do. I think corporations, leaders of corporations, still struggle with ethics and values and what's best for the corporation, what's best for the stakeholders, and what's best for society. And this is a conflict that's going to go on within corporations for many years to come. Let's face it, there's still many countries, China, Russia, where the oversight of corporations doing business outside of their countries, in places like Africa, in places like Latin America, are not as rigid as the oversight is for corporations in the United States or in Europe. And there's no question that there are business leaders today whose philosophy still relies more on meeting financial objectives than on creating social benefit. So while we've made a lot of progress in the corporate environment, there's still a long way to go. This report that I referred to, this verification report, is important in particular because it allows not only corporate leaders to better assess their progress in implementing compliance programs through the use of outside third-party independent consultancies, but it also allows the NGO community, civil society, to know better how corporations are doing, whether they're actually implementing the policies, the procedures that you see on their website, their codes of conduct, their policies on whistleblowers, their policies on vendors and suppliers. All of these policies, it doesn't take a great deal of, it's not rocket scientry today to write a good code of conduct. But implementing a code of conduct within your corporation is the more difficult act to follow. Now let me take off my hat for a second as a TI leader to put on my corporate hat and remind everyone here that years ago, when the FCPA was first enacted back in the late 70s, U.S. corporations complained bitterly about the United States creating an unlevel playing field, about their not being able to compete in the world market against companies that weren't under the same laws, rules, and regulations. Today, as a corporate leader, I'm hearing more about an unlevel playing field between corporations and governments. Because while corporations have taken many steps to improve their internal procedures, to improve their transparency and accountability, we have not yet seen the same sort of effort on the part of countries to improve their anti-corruption infrastructure. Let me give you a good example. We talked earlier, my colleagues here talked earlier about the role of agents and how important it is for corporations to do adequate due diligence on who they're hiring to help them promote their services, their products in countries around the world. Well, what about the role of government in vetting these same agents? Why couldn't we have a system whereby governments would license agents based on their financial stability, based on their honesty and integrity? These are the same agents that are interfacing with government ministries and government agencies to help sell service and products. Why is it only left up to the private sector to ensure the integrity of these agents and not left up to, as well, government agencies to decide who they want to do business with as middleman? I only use that as one example because I think the time has come for the NGO community, for civil society, to begin to concentrate as much on improvements in government anti-corruption programs as they have been focusing on corporate anti-corruption programs. It's time again to begin leveling the playing field because we're not going to be able to improve the anti-corruption perspective without the cooperation of both private sector and public sector. We're holding private sector's toes to the fire, if you will. We're fining corporations billions, hundreds of millions, and sometimes billions of dollars. Corporate executives are being put in jail. But yet, government leaders, high-level government officials in many countries act with impunity and beyond the law and beyond the reach of the justice systems around the world. Let me finish by also addressing this issue of education, anti-corruption education and training. I was privileged to be also a founder, and I sit as chairman of the International Advisory Board of the International Anti-Corruption Academy, which is located in Austria, just outside of Vienna. You know, I'm proud to be affiliated with this institution and proud to announce that this academy now has an accredited master's degree in anti-corruption services, the first such program in the world today. For too long, our higher education system has ignored the academic study in the area of good governance, compliance, ethics, and values. I mean, every law school, of course, has had Ethics 101. And students have gone through that course, not because they really have wanted to, but because they've had to as part of their legal education. Now it's time to get serious at the primary school level, middle school level, and in universities around the world about teaching values, teaching ethics, what it really means, and how it should be applied practically in the global world of trade today. It's a serious issue, and it's one that I think, I speak before many audiences of college students, and it's one that I believe that college students today are paying more and more attention to. It used to be years ago when I spoke to college students that are going into the job market, they wanted to know how they can make the most money. How can they get a job in Wall Street? Today, I hear more from college students, how do we determine if a corporation has a good set of values? Because we want to work in an environment which is an environment of integrity. We want to work at a place where we can make a difference to society. So the trends are different. We have to give these students the tools to understand what good values, what good ethics are. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias a Michael Hirschman. Vamos a pasar ahora entonces a la ronda de preguntas. Por favor, indicar a quién se realiza la pregunta y ser lo más concretos, por favor. Comienzo con El Salvador.
Thank you very much. I have questions both for Leslie and Michael. My question for Leslie regards a more systematic approach of what CREATE does. I think it's a wonderful initiative. I think it has tremendous potential, and my concrete question is the fact that I was wondering whether there has been any approach in terms of incorporating what CREATE produces as content within free trade agreements.
Well, thank you for your question and for your kind words about our process. We haven't actually begun that process, although we have engaged in trade dialogues in Washington. We're only 3 years old. I think I mentioned that we were founded in 2011. We've spent probably the first 2 years of our existence sort of understanding what works for companies, what doesn't, looking at the guidance that's come from TI and others, and in full transparency, I also worked for Transparency International USA for a very long time and really appreciate the work that they do. And then the third year of our existence has really been piloting our service and working with companies. So that's somewhere we want to go. And I appreciate the suggestion, and we'll hopefully the next time I'm in front of the body, I can report some progress in that regard.
Thank you very much. Michael?
Sí, perdón. Una vez que haga la pregunta El Salvador, vamos a aprovechar y vamos a hacer las preguntas también de Antigua y Barbuda y Argentina. Les pido por favor a los ponentes que tomen nota, y Perú vamos viendo, vamos un poco viendo el número de preguntas que hay para que puedan contestar todas a la vez al finalizar. Por favor, El Salvador, y de ahí primero El Salvador, luego damos la palabra a Argentina, Antigua y Barbuda. El Salvador, por favor.
Michael, 2 questions for you. In your role as a TI official, the index of perception of corruption, is it evolving or not? And how can we make something that's a little more concrete instead of just perception? That's a word that's always thrown me off. And I guess the second question would be, and I tend to agree with you in terms of optimism, that there is much more attention paid to the issue of transparency, and companies are much more pliable in terms of adapting themselves to ethical practices and so on. And I guess my big question on this second matter would be what you think is and should be the role of the media. Thank you.
Gracias, El Salvador. Argentina, por favor.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Ante todo, agradecer mucho la presentación de los 3 ponentes, que fue muy interesante, y en lo personal, un gusto conocer personalmente a Michael Hirschman, que yo conocía de nombre porque yo fui director de Transparencia Internacional en Argentina y su prestigio lo precede, así que es un gusto haberlo conocido. La pregunta, en realidad, es una muy pequeña reflexión, muy corta, con una pregunta. Como ustedes saben, en la región y en muchos países últimamente hay una percepción, una opinión peyorativa respecto del sector privado. Hay un fortalecimiento de la opinión favorable sobre la acción del Estado en la economía y una opinión incluso en algunos países hasta precapitalista, que consideran que el capitalismo es intrínsecamente corrupto y que lo que hay que hacer es modificar las reglas del juego del capitalismo. Digamos, es un hecho, es un discurso que se escucha en la región. Entonces, coincido con Michael Hirschman sobre el desnivel en el campo de juego. Es verdad que hay mucha impunidad en el sector público, mientras que se está avanzando mucho en la multa a las empresas y a los empresarios. Ahora bien, una de las críticas que se le hace precisamente al sector privado es que se adaptan a las reglas del juego. Por ejemplo, en el caso de las petroleras, se suele decir que hacen negocios en África The African Way, a la manera africana, se adaptan al terreno. De hecho, Peter Egan fundó Transparencia Internacional luego de 25 años de funcionario, de funcionario del Banco Mundial en África. Entonces él ahí vio cómo las empresas del sector privado trabajaban en África con las reglas de África, no intentaban modificarlas. Ustedes, con la experiencia que tienen internacionalmente, ¿cómo hacen para trabajar con este discurso? Para intentar modificarlo, para intentar suavizarlo, para intentar acercar posiciones en el sector público y el sector privado que pareciera que en muchos lugares de Latinoamérica están realmente con una brecha importante. Gracias.
Gracias, Argentina. Entiendo que la pregunta es generalizada para los tres ponentes. Perfecto. Antigua y Barbuda, por favor.
Good afternoon to the panel. Thank you very much for your presentations this afternoon. I have a question and a comment. And my question is to the Bar Association. Can't remember your name, I'm sorry. And then I have a question and sort of comment to Michael. I'm from a small island of about 80,000 people. And for a small island of about 80,000 people, we have a lot of lawyers. We do not have big law firms. We have small single practitioners, and a big law firm would probably be about 4 lawyers. In giving your presentation seemed to be reaching out to, your program seemed to reach out to these big law firms, and I'm not sure if in between or if I missed it that there's anything that reaches out to these smaller law firms, chambers, and single practitioners. And the reason I bring it up is that within Antigua and Barbuda, a single practitioner could be defending a murderer today, opening a company the next day, and involved in what is called our Citizen by Investment Partnership Program. Something which I think is going to attract a lot of international persons and corporations, and as a result of this, I think that the attorneys within Antigua and Barbuda need to be aware of the conventions and the international regulations on corruption. What do you have in place, and have you done anything? Are there any programs that you have set, or do you have any plans to reach out to small island states like ours? And to Michael, I'm very happy to hear about the anti-corruption program in respect to the university in Austria, outside of Austria. And why I'm happy to say is that I've actually been thrown to the sharks to swim or float right now. And with respect to that program, what I wanted to get from you was, what is the flexibility, the availability? Is it something that can be done online? Is it something that you have to go to? You must go to the university. That's what I'm trying to get from you. Thank you.
Gracias, Antigua y Barbuda. Vamos a pasar a responder estas preguntas y luego tenemos un segundo bloque de preguntas, Perú, Haití y Ecuador, en ese orden. Creo que por la cantidad de preguntas empezamos con Gonzalo, luego Leslie, luego Michael, por favor.
¿Quieres que responda lo de los regionalizados o los dejamos con ellos? Okay, so I will start with the last question, your question. There are programs. We are responding to the needs of the different jurisdictions. We know that every jurisdiction is different, and we have a duty, especially as the UN ODC is involved here, of reaching out to all audiences. When I refer to the workshops and I refer to interacting more with firms that are bringing international business transactions, you're absolutely right. It doesn't mean big law firms in all the jurisdictions. In some jurisdictions, you have sole practitioners that are key individuals where the investment just comes from. And especially, you know, that this might be a revolving door case in many cases as well. You have former ministers that just go, they're lawyers, and they become lawyers, they just go around. So we are addressing that. And depending on the jurisdictions, unfortunately, we haven't got directly to Antigua and Barbuda, but we organized one in Panama together with the Anti-Corruption Academy that UNODC set up there a couple of years ago, and we sent invitations to Antigua and Barbuda. No one came. But it doesn't mean that that was the only solution. So as we knew that we needed to reach to other jurisdictions, what we have done is that, for instance, we have issued this guidance for bar associations. And this is a tool that they can just, it's self-explanatory. They will find it, and they will be able to implement a lot of the steps there. But the door is always open. And if you feel that your jurisdiction has a special need, we'll be very happy to do it. I mean, we have done other documents. We have just completed a handbook that we launched in the COSP last year together as well with the organizations, plus the World Bank on the umbrella of the G20 and handbook for compliance officers. So there are different responses to that. And then for the previous question, we'll switch to Spanish for that one. A tu pregunta de la regionalización. Es bien difícil a veces enfrentarse a una audiencia con los brazos caídos, en que le dice a uno, bueno, para obtener un certificado de buena conducta empresarial necesito yo hacer filas de las 4 de la mañana, llegar a las 6 de la mañana, pagar un pago para que me dejen entrar al sitio donde me va a salir el número y necesito volver a pagar para pasar entonces yo al counter para volver a pagar para que me salga no en 4 meses sino en un día. O sea, esto se ve y es muy difícil con eso. Pero yo creo que la solución, no sé si esto, y de pronto Jorge me puede contar si eso fue lo que se inventaron, pero lo que yo creo es que algo aplica aquí bien simpático, porque para los que sepan de Derecho Comercial Internacional, alguna vez un profesor que se llama Jacques Bawati, cuando les preguntaban sobre los distintos acuerdos comerciales y la cantidad de acuerdos comerciales versus la OMC, él se inventó, o por lo menos aludió a esa expresión en ese momento, que es el plato de espaguetis. Hay un plato de espaguetis donde hay un cierto número de tratados que pueden llevar a una solución y puede ser como un stepping stone hacia comercio. Yo creo que aquí con las convenciones, digamos que se ha tratado de que si un país, por ejemplo, y si uno está enfrentado en África, como lo hemos hecho también en jurisdicciones muy distintas que pueden haber en África, uno puede decir, bueno, probablemente aquí no hay enforcement, probablemente aquí no hay, pero tengan en cuenta este concepto que probablemente uno nunca lo vio en derecho, cuando fue a una escuela de derecho, sobre todo si tuvo formación en derecho civil, que es la extraterritorialidad. O sea, no piense que porque no pasa nada en Namibia, por decir algo, no va a pasar nada a su compañía que usted está representando en Estados Unidos y que puede tener implicaciones a ustedes. Entonces, al mostrar ese efecto dominó que existe, realmente uno puede abrir una puerta de atención y que ellos entiendan que la responsabilidad se sale de la frontera y que es una cosa extraordinaria para los que nos formamos en una jurisdicción únicamente. Ese es mi aporte frente a ese tema de la regionalización y cómo responderlo.
Gracias, Gonzalo. Doy la palabra a Leslie, por favor.
Okay, well, I will follow and agree with what Gonzalo said. And, you know, probably what I have to add isn't anything particularly original or that everyone in this room hasn't thought about before. I think you have to take a holistic approach. I agree with Gonzalo that harmonization of law has been extremely important. There are just fewer places for companies to hide. You know, we'd like to see more enforcement by countries, but if not by countries, by governments that have this extraterritorial reach. I think that's helpful. I'd like to see companies actually prosecuting the public officials on the demand or the receiving side. I think much more work needs to be done there. That's extremely important. What we're doing, this idea that we're trying, and we're by no means the only ones, but what we're doing with others in sort of focusing on the privatization of anti-corruption enforcement, that is, companies requiring their business partners or encouraging their business partners to have good programs in place and to actually implement them and help them to do that. I think that's another important piece of the puzzle. But, you know, this is really hard. There are jurisdictions in the world that are just very difficult for companies to work in. And, you know, you can find local champions. There are companies that are champions. There are individuals that are champions. I think working, you know, sort of a sectoral approach or an industry approach, like we've seen with, Patchy, which Michael and I both mentioned before, which started as a construction industry initiative and has really grown. But, companies, like-minded companies getting together, agreeing to principles, adhering to those principles, reporting on them so that what they're doing becomes more than a paper exercise, but a real exercise that then civil society can look at and hold them to account for. I think all those are important, not magic bullets, but important steps.
Muchísimas gracias. Leslie, por favor, Michael.
Thank you. Some very good questions. I'm pleased to see that we have a very interactive crowd here today. It's not always the case, by the way. I'll tell you a little story. Back in 1999, I believe it was, I was asked to go to Europe and give a presentation on the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act to 30 of the top executives of Siemens. This was a year in which Siemens listed on the New York Stock Exchange. So they would fall under the jurisdiction of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And of course, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is somewhat technical and complicated. I spoke for about an hour and a half on the subject and asked for questions, and there wasn't one question. A short 8 years or 9 years later, I was called back to be the independent compliance advisor to Siemens at the point where their offices had been raided by the Munich prosecutors. And I want to tell you that of the 30 people in that room, most of them had been fired 10 years later or put in prison. So I'm always happy to see when there are questions, because I'd hate to see something like that happen to any of you in this room. The CPI. The CPI, Corruption Perception Index, is evolving. When we first founded Transparency International, CPI is about 16 years old now. When we first founded Transparency International, we had a big argument as to whether we should do the CPI, because the whole principle of Transparency International is to bring together the private sector, civil society, and the public sector and government. And in order to do so, we felt we had to be very careful not to attack or criticize any one pillar of society. So we've had a big argument, but we decided to go ahead and do this perception index. And frankly, it turned out to be a very smart decision, not only for the branding of Transparency International, but to encourage governments to do better. I remember, for example, on our first list, the then president of Malaysia was very offended by where Malaysia fell on the list. And in fact, he prohibited anyone from Transparency International visiting Malaysia for a year or two. But the fact of the matter is, he said, however, we're going to do better next year, and we're going to move up on the list. The polls that we use now, we have changed the dynamics of the CPI in the last 2 years. It's being done much more professionally, much more scientifically today than it ever has been done before, with much more independent polling. But it will never, ever be anything but a perception list. Let's face it, corruption is a covert crime. There's no way to determine how much corruption is really going on in any one particular country. You certainly can't use arrest statistics or conviction statistics, because frankly, in many countries, they don't even exist. So the list is useful. I don't find many people that argue that perhaps, I know it's not very diplomatic to use the names of countries in discussions like this, but not many people argue that Iraq or Nigeria shouldn't be at the bottom of the list. Maybe you can argue that Iraq should be one space above Nigeria, but it really doesn't matter. Most people look at the list as being a very useful tool in helping determine the level of risk in going into countries and doing business there. The media. Their role is, I can't begin to describe how important the role of media is today in uncovering corruption in both the public and private sector. And I think if you take a look at the index of press freedom, it will be no surprise to you to learn that those countries that have little freedom of press have the highest degree of corruption in them. We encourage the media. TI has programs to help train the media. The International Anti-Corruption Academy has many students in it that are journalists. We have to support the media worldwide. They are on the front lines. It's not infrequently that we'll read a story about a journalist being attacked or a journalist being killed because of reporting on corruption. Unfortunately, we've also at TI had our own staff killed and in prisons, advocating on behalf of good governance. This is a fight that we all have to this is a battle we all have to fight together. And some people are going to be harmed in the battle against corruption. We have to hopefully give the tools to the press they need to do a good job, an accurate job. Look, the other thing I have to say about the press, they have a responsibility for accurate reporting as well. There are many countries where you can buy a journalist to report on corruption issues, particularly when you're running for office in that country. That's just as harmful to the journalism sector as it is to any other industry. So we have to support the press, but we have to also make sure that the press is reporting accurately. My friend from Argentina, so good to see you. There is a loss of trust in many countries when it comes to business. But look, we've had to bridge the gap between trust between business, civil society, business, government and civil society for years now. In my judgment, the solution is not to walk away from capitalism, to turn to state enterprise. I think you'll find in history as many problems, if not more, in terms of good governance, transparency and accountability in state-run companies as there has been in private industry. So the movement toward state enterprise is not the solution here. The solution here is education of government and civil society as to the importance of business and the good that business can bring to a country, particularly if a business is enlightened and understands the necessity for corporate social responsibility, particularly when a business understands that giving back to communities is just as important as taking profits from communities. Finally, on the Academy is an international organization. It has been accredited by the United Nations as such. We have 60 countries who have signed the treaty creating the Academy. More countries are signing every day. I urge any of the countries at this table who have not yet signed the treaty supporting the Academy to do so. The Academy has classes throughout the year, not only a master's program as I described, but it runs classes on a variety of topics having to do with transparency and accountability all year long. Anyone is welcome to join those classes. Some of them are as short as 3 or 4 or 5 days. You'll find the students from all over the world. You'll find them from the business community, from the press, from the governmental community. With regard specifically to the master's program, it is a program where it's done in part through the internet and in part sessions held in Austria. Many of the students that are attending the master's program are professionals. They come out of the workplace. So they can't spend 1.5 years of their lives in a classroom in Austria. We make it as easy as we can for them to attend through the internet, to get to Austria from time to time for in-person classes as well. They have a wonderful website, by the way. The facility is amazing. It's a really extraordinary. It's a 16th century monastery that the government of Austria had rehabilitated, spent 24 million euros to rehabilitate for our use.
Muchísimas gracias por las respuestas. Doy paso a la delegada de Perú.
Gracias, presidente. En realidad quería hacer un comentario a partir de lo que han estado señalando en las exposiciones y particularmente la de Gonzalo. Y es que, bueno, partiendo del hecho de que la corrupción está al igual que en el sector público como en el sector privado, esa es la premisa de la cual, por lo menos en Perú, partimos, sí nos resultaba necesario identificar en dónde, tanto en el sector privado como en el sector público, estaba la corrupción. Y en esa medida realizamos una encuesta con el gremio empresarial más grande en Perú, con dos de los gremios más grandes empresariales de Perú, y realizamos esta encuesta a 250 empresas, las top empresas, y lo hicimos con el apoyo justamente del Banco Mundial. Aquí está Francesca Recanatini, con ella estuvimos trabajando inclusive en la plantilla de la encuesta. Y fue muy interesante ver que las empresas señalaron que destinaban ellos el 5.8% de su presupuesto a gastos orientados a facilitar algunos trámites, ¿no? O aceitar, como se dice en mi país. Pero lo interesante fue que al momento de preguntarles a los empresarios, a los CEOs, cuáles eran, digamos, los grupos que se prestaban o que más fácilmente accedían a ofrecer una coima dentro del sector privado, resultó siendo el grupo de los abogados. Y hay toda una interesante información ahí de cómo profesionalmente hay algunos grupos, ocupacionalmente, mejor dicho, algunos grupos que mayor facilidad tienen para este tipo de prácticas. Y este comentario lo hacía a partir de la encuesta que nos planteaba o que nos comentaba Gonzalo, pero creo que sería interesante, no sé si es que lo han hecho ya, hacer un estudio similar a nivel de lo que son las empresas, o no sé si la representante de Create lo ha hecho en su entidad, pero sí resultaría interesante ver a nivel mundial, a nivel de por lo menos a nivel latinoamericano, cómo es que se comportan los diferentes grupos ocupacionales al interior de las empresas, ¿no? Ese es el comentario que quería hacer. Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Perú. Haití, por favor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. J'ai une première question, c'est pour Michael, et plus précisément sous sa casquette de président ou bien de membre de TI. Et nous savons que dans le temps, il y avait des États qui encourageaient même la corruption internationale, la corruption en déduisant les montants payés par des entreprises pour conquérir des marchés. Est-ce qu'à sa connaissance, il existe encore des entreprises, plutôt des pays qui continuent avec cette pratique? Et j'ai une autre question qui s'adresse à la représentante de Create. Quand il y a des problèmes de corruption internationale impliquant des entreprises, la pratique, semble-t-il, était de privilégier des règlements qui consistent à dédommager les États victimes de corruption. Selon vous, est-ce que vous pensez que c'est la meilleure façon peut-être de décourager la corruption dans ce secteur? Car selon nous, si une entreprise sait qu'elle peut toujours s'arranger pour dédommager un État victime de corruption, elle peut toujours continuer à pratiquer la corruption et s'arranger pour avoir l'argent pour payer. J'aimerais avoir votre opinion là-dessus. Je ne sais pas, j'ai ma collègue qui est à côté de moi qui semble avoir une question aussi pour vous.
Ma question s'adresse à Gonzalo. Je félicite l'initiative de International Bar Association pour la préparation du guide à l'intention des avocats, des professionnels du droit. Mais malheureusement, nous avons pu obtenir ce guide à partir du site de l'ONUDC. Nous, en Haïti, on voudrait préparer un guide, alors préparer une formation pour les différents barreaux. Malheureusement, le guide est volumineux et la traduction coûte cher. Dans votre intervention, vous avez dit que vous comptez travailler avec les pays de l'Afrique. Or, nous savons qu'il y a beaucoup de pays francophones en Afrique. Donc, est-ce que vous comptez mettre en place un programme spécifique pour les pays francophones? C'est-à-dire, est-ce que vous comptez traduire ce guide en français? Et ce sera peut-être dans combien de temps? Parce que nous autres en Haïti, nous sommes intéressés à avoir ce guide en français. Je vous remercie.
Gracias, Haití. Ecuador, por favor.
Gracias, señor presidente. Buenas tardes. Yo realmente he estado muy atenta a las tres presentaciones y quiero sinceramente felicitarlos por la preocupación que nos han expresado en el sentido de querer aportar hacia los distintos sectores, tanto abogados como países que tienen grandes inversores en toda la parte comercial. Y creo que el hecho mismo expresado, no me recuerdo por cuál de los expositores, de que conozcan que existen convenios, tratados internacionales para que precisamente estas empresas transnacionales también puedan respetar de toda esa normativa a nivel de los países donde hacen transacciones comerciales, porque una de las grandes preocupaciones de mi país, Ecuador, es a partir del caso Chevron que los amazónicos durante 30 años han venido tratando de que se haga justicia frente a la inversión que hizo Chevron y dejó destruida la Amazonía de mi país. Y es precisamente en esa línea es que los países que conforman UNASUR, hace 2 días o ayer me parece, conformaron el Observatorio de Empresas Transnacionales para hacer precisamente la vigilancia ante el respeto a la normativa internacional que se debe tener. Digo esto como antecedente porque una de las concepciones o percepciones, cogiendo lo que dijo el compañero de Argentina en su última parte, lo que los países de Centroamérica y de América del Sur hemos venido viendo, ¿no? De cómo las empresas tienen esta falta de responsabilidad social. Estos últimos años se ha venido, sí, dando algunas expresiones de muchas empresas de cumplir con esa responsabilidad social. Pero vemos que todavía el camino es muy largo por recorrer. Y sí me parece que por parte, por ejemplo, de la IACA, que es una de las, igual ahora con Panamá en Centroamérica, con el instituto, podamos tener esa posibilidad y facilidad de capacitar y preparar tanto a la parte privada como a la parte pública para que podamos además entender y comprender que existen mecanismos para luchar contra la corrupción. De esto de aquí parecería que no nos liberamos nadie. Y en ese camino creo que hay que ir trabajando y los esfuerzos que está haciendo UNASUR, al menos ahora que estaba viendo las noticias con la conformación del observatorio, creo que nos permitiría ir también trabajando en ese camino. Y me parece interesante las preocupaciones que han planteado los expositores, porque nosotros tenemos como país una gran lucha que es en el tema de Chevron, y por eso nos interesa y nos seguirá interesando la necesidad de poner en el tapete todos estos derechos que los pueblos tenemos, ¿no? Un poco la reflexión y el camino hacia ir adoptando mecanismos en los países, tanto en el sector público y privado, para hacer vigilancia desde la ciudadanía a que se cumplan y se respeten estos convenios y las normativas.
Vamos a dar la palabra a Estados Unidos y luego a Jamaica y luego pasaremos a las respuestas. Y esta sería la última ronda de preguntas. Por favor, Estados Unidos.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is directed to Gonzalo. I'm very happy to hear about the programs that are taking place in law schools. I think that the young lawyers coming up are going to be a great force for reform, and I'm glad that you're there working with them. My question goes, though, to the problem of lawyers don't work in a vacuum, and they, at some point in time, they have to interact with the judiciary and their respective judicial systems, and some judicial systems are more transparent than others, and not unsurprisingly, the less transparent ones tend to promote or provide a hospitable environment, at least, for corruption, to the extent that in some countries, lawyers can't be effective without resorting to some level of corruption. So I'm wondering if there's anything in the work with law schools or in other venues where you're looking at the issue of the judicial system and its transparency and its ability to foster or inhibit corruption. Thank you.
Gracias, Estados Unidos. Jamaica, por favor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And my question is directed to Michael. I was very pleased to hear your reference to the need for ethics to be taught in schools. And the thought struck me. We see various programs relating to reducing corruption on the part of companies and reducing corruption on the part of government. However, to what extent has there been enough of a focus on the general populace? Because the thought struck me that many times the corruption in, for example, the government is fed by the willingness of the man on the street to pay, for example, a government official to do something. So that while persons may say, yes, the government or officials in the government are corrupt, this in turn is often fed by the willingness of the man on the street, the private citizen, to actually participate in some way. And so I wanted to know to what extent the general populace is being advised and informed that they have a very important role to play in the reduction of corruption and in the reduction of a country's position on the index. Because many times when the results come out, people will just, in the very country, just step back and say, see, the country is corrupt, the public officials are corrupt, the judges are corrupt. But the question is, who is it who facilitates this? Who is it who is paying the person? Who is it who is asking for these favors? So that's the question I'm asking. How much focus is there on the general populace to let them know that they have a role to play in the reduction of corruption?
Muchas gracias, Jamaica. Vamos a pasar entonces a las respuestas en el mismo orden que la ronda de respuestas anterior. Por favor, empezamos con Gonzalo.
Gracias. Okay, I will actually going to start as well from the last question from the United States. It is true. Definitely, there are two sides of the coin when you're looking at the legal profession. And that was actually just corroborated as well last year in the second report that I use in my presentation. We're asking clients, like, when you think of lawyers, where do you think is like the risk is coming from, or what sort of interaction that the lawyer has is bringing you more concerns? And no surprise, it was the interaction that they have with the judiciary. When we decided to launch the strategy, we wanted to be very conservative as well in the start. And sometimes you get excited and then you want to launch a project that is like really embracing all the different angles where you can act. But I think we started from the right place. I think at that time, back in the day, we thought, well, there are some other organizations that little, but still they're looking at the judiciary. Also, the UNCAC and the Chapter 11 on the corruption in the judiciary was being developed on a guidance, so we wanted to wait. And then we really thought that no one was doing a lot on the side of the practitioners, so we started there. But it's great that you asked me that question, because one of the reasons why I was coming here to the US is because one of the plans for the next 2 years in the strategy is going to be exactly that one. And it's funny because, Francesca, I needed to talk to you this morning. I was in the World Bank, and all roads seem to lead to you in this. But we participated in that development of the Chapter 11 with the UNCAC, and there is this idea of starting to pilot test as well what we can do from this. So there's going to come as well the third report, and the third report is going to actually be devoted to that. What is the perception actually from the lawyers, from what is going on with the courts? I also teach in Mexico, for instance, and it's a dismay when you actually have last year's students of law that they are already actually working because they work like for the last 2 years of work. And then you see that they say, well, I mean, you want to get the photocopies, you need to give a little bit of money. You want to get actually access to the files, you need to, not always money, it's that interaction that you have. So you're absolutely right, and we're going in the right direction. That's the good news. Thank you for asking. I think we missed the person from Haiti that asked the question, but yes. Oh yeah, you're there. Yes. We actually translated, I was just checking, and it hasn't been put up on the website, but it's translated into Spanish and French. All documents in the IBA, all the official documents, are being translated into the 3 languages. And we are conscious about the importance of reaching out. I mean, if it was me, I would try to translate it in all the languages, but we are just working right now in those 3. And it's very important. I mean, for instance, next week I will be in Rwanda and Uganda doing a little bit of this, and you kind of think that languages are important to the point that the Law Society in Rwanda decided to translate this into other official languages in the country. And just a reflection on Peru. I was very interested to hear that. I really want to see that survey. It's very interesting that you are doing this at the local level. Peru was one of the first countries that we visited, and actually I remember, with this I close, that was one of the best anecdotes that we got as well going around the world. And we were with the director of legal affairs of the OECD sitting on the table just doing these workshops, and then one of the lawyers raised the hand and tell the case of the Norwegian petroleum company that I think the transcript was taken from the former Minister of Mines and the current Minister of Mines, and he has an amazing quote that I still use. And they were saying that they needed to make sure that the Norwegian company was going to get the contract, and that they needed to involve one of those lawyers that were Hermes ties, whatever that means. So you can tell that they wanted to involve lawyers that were like well-respected lawyers, perhaps, and with access. And that gave us a lot of impetus as well for going around. And I think that now it was taken back to the working group on bribery, just that fact. But yeah, very interested to hear that. So if you can share that with me, I would appreciate it. Thanks.
Muchas gracias, Gonzalo. Leslie, por favor.
Okay, I'll start with the question from Haiti. And I absolutely agree with you that enforcement isn't the sole or the only or the best driver of corporate behavior. It's certainly a driver. You know, we can look at sort of the compliance level of companies that are headquarters in companies with very vigorous enforcement, and, you know, as opposed to those headquartered in countries with very little enforcement, and you do see a difference. You see a greater level of compliance when enforcement is driving that. But sort of the avoidance of the parade of horrible things, the fines, the penalties, even the reputational damage, which tends to be very short-lived, quite frankly, isn't enough. Luckily for us, many of the companies that we've been working with, you know, have sort of self-selected into our program, so they're already inclined to do this. But we are working with companies that we have to go out and make the business case. You know, the business case that corruption is bad for business. And one of the things that is, I think, most useful is the sort of anecdotal evidence that comes from cases that we see. And I think Michael will correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the Siemens case, there was a very strong argument to be made that the corruption there was bad for business. That's very important to make the argument that if corruption is happening in your company, other bad things probably are too. Embezzlement, fraud. So you sort of get into this slipstream of illegality if you're a company that isn't paying attention to ethics. You're not attracting good employees, or the ones that you have very degraded morale when they understand that they're working for a company that has an unethical culture, an immoral culture. But there's a more positive spin that we like to make, which is that not only is corruption bad for business, but compliance and ethics is good for business. And it's a little harder to get that evidence. But again, there are sort of anecdotal stories that that's true. And I have a former colleague from TI, one of Michael's colleagues, Ben Heineman, former general counsel of GE, who's written about high performance with high integrity. When you sort of look at the flip side, that companies that are acting with integrity, that are good corporate citizens, they're attracting good employees, they're attracting good business partners, that there's this argument to be made that compliance is actually good for business. When you can make that argument for companies, along with the other business case, I think that's also an important driver of corporate behavior, good corporate behavior. And then on the question from Peru, we haven't actually done those studies. We know that compliance is very, very expensive. We've now worked, I think when I told you my pilot results were from about 25 companies. We've now worked with about 70, and we're continuing to add. And that's some of the data that we're actually trying to pull. But we have a very small sample at this point. But I think it's important to look at that, and hopefully we'll have some results that we can share publicly soon.
Gracias, Leslie. Michael, por favor.
Thank you. Let me just follow up on the comment Leslie made about corruption being bad for business. It's interesting, it's not just about reputational damage. It's not just about hundreds of millions, tens of millions of dollars in fines. When I went into Siemens, and I've done this in other companies now, I looked at some of the contracts that were won through bribes. We went back 10 years, and Siemens, we found, had paid $1.8 billion in bribes over a period of 10 years in over 20 countries. But I wanted to see individual contracts and what they look like, the ones they won through this bribery. Almost in every case, they lost money on those contracts that were won through bribes. And I compared them with contracts that were won legitimately, and the profit margins were much greater. This is not only Siemens, but in many companies. Let's think about this for a second. You're adding the cost of the bribe, which obviously comes off of your top and bottom line, but you're also entering into a very dangerous agreement with another party who all of a sudden becomes a member of your family. If you're building a hospital and you won that bid through corruption by bribing the deputy minister for health services in a country, and that hospital collapses, who's going to be held responsible? You've got a real argument on your hand between those who gave the bribe and those who received the bribe as to who's going to be held responsible. You're in bed with essentially a bad guy, a crook, and you can't get rid of that. With regard to the delegate from Haiti, there was a time when countries indeed encouraged corruption by allowing corporations to deduct the cost of the bribe as a marketing expense. We don't see this anymore. That has been taken off the table for some time, particularly since the OECD convention. But we still see ways in which governments can encourage corruption by lack of enforcement, particularly of those companies that are doing business outside of the country. I mentioned earlier China and Russia. While China has had a very strong internal crackdown on corruption, and is making progress in the fight against corruption, they still have not regulated their companies so that their companies doing business outside of China do business ethically. And so there is that form of encouragement. Are fines enough? No. Fines are not enough. You have to hold individuals responsible. But that's on both sides. I mean, we're faced with a situation today which is, in my judgment, inexplicable. If you look at a settlement agreement between our Justice Department and a company, or if you look at an agreement between the World Bank and a company that has been debarred or suspended, it details the payments that the company has made. It details the bad conduct that the company has engaged in. And if you read one of these things, this is what you'll read. Company X paid $1.2 million in bribes to official ABC. They'll name the company. They'll say Siemens paid $1.2 million in bribes in XYZ country, but they will not name the individual who the bribe was given to. So that individual remains unknown, anonymous, in government until the next company comes around that he extorts bribes from. And it's a vicious cycle. Without the Justice Department, without the World Bank, without the Inter-American Development Bank, Asia Development Bank, African Development Bank, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, without these organizations being willing to stand up and identify those in government who are taking the bribes and have them held accountable, we're not going to be able to get where we want to go in reducing the amount of corruption in business. The delegate from Ecuador, I'm so happy that you raised the issue that you raised. Because when I go into a company to advise a leader on compliance, he wants to talk about corruption. Why? Because it's on everyone's minds. That's what you read about in the newspapers. I want to talk about corruption too, but I want to talk about environmental compliance. I want to talk about child labor issues. I want to talk about safety and security issues. Compliance applies across the board to issues that go far beyond corruption. And we all know the damages that corruption can create in a society. Well, sometimes those damages can be dwarfed by a company's ignoring good environmental practices or good human labor practices, encouraging child labor, encouraging slavery. So when a company deals today in the world of global trade, they have to make sure that they understand best practices in a host of different sectors, including intellectual property as well. Jamaica, the culture of corruption in countries. Look, it starts with you and me as parents, assuming you are a parent. I am. Unless we're willing to teach our children good values, and not only through our words, but through our actions, we're not going to encourage our children to be better citizens. When you're stopped by a police officer and your child is in the car and you pay that police officer a few dollars to ignore the violation, what message is that sending to your child? At home, you may tell him, look, don't cheat, don't steal, don't lie. But the minute you compromise your own values by paying that money to that police officer, you send a message to your child that corruption is okay. And I know that there's been a breakdown in the family systems, not only in the United States, but throughout the world today. And it's not so easy in stressful environments today where sometimes You have parents that are unemployed, sometimes parents working 2, 3 jobs just to make ends meet. But unless we take the time to teach our children the difference between right and wrong, and unless we encourage our educators in primary schools, when they first begin going to school, to make values and ethics part of the curriculum, part of the everyday curriculum. It doesn't have to be a specialized course, but when you're talking about history, when you're talking about technology, when you're talking about mathematics, talk about the values as well. And it's particularly true, by the way, when you're talking today about technology and the use of the internet. Because the internet creates a sense of anonymity amongst young children where they think that they can do things that they ordinarily wouldn't do if they were doing it in person. So we have a huge effort in front of us to turn around in many cultures where corruption is the norm, how young people believe. It's up to us as parents, it's up to the educators, it's up to the businessmen, it's up to government to do that. But you're absolutely right. Unless we stop those who are willing to give the bribes, we're not going to win that battle against corruption. That's it, I think.
Muchísimas gracias. A nombre del comité quiero agradecerles a nuestros ponentes. Ha sido un panel de lujo en realidad el que hemos tenido. Las puertas de aquí siempre abiertas. A ustedes les felicitamos por todos los esfuerzos que realizan en cada una de sus áreas. Voy a pedirles un aplauso para nuestros panelistas, por favor. Muchísimas gracias y continuaríamos entonces con la presentación a cargo del Banco Mundial, la iniciativa Autoridades Anticorrupción. Continuamos entonces, damos la bienvenida a Francesca Recantini. Ella es Senior Economist del Public Sector and Governance, Middle East and North Africa del Banco Mundial. Damos la palabra a Francesca, bienvenida.
Thank you. I'm gonna change a little bit what I'm planning. My apologies to my colleague that know me. The presentation is in Spanish and is available to all of you, and also in English is available, but I'm gonna make it in English so that hopefully all of us can follow since we couldn't have both slides in English, Spanish, and French. thank you again to the colleague that have organized this, this event to invite us and participate. I'm here today to talk about one of the many initiatives that the World Bank has developed over the past 15, almost 20 years in the area of reducing the risk of corruption. And I would like to emphasize I'm just one of the many practitioners that works inside the World Bank in this area. Here in the room, 3 of my colleagues have joined me just to show the extent of our interest, not only on the area, but also on the thematic area, but also on the geographical area. How important for us is to be able to talk about governance and anti-corruption in Latin America. The previous panel, the question that were posed in the discussion was incredibly interesting. And there is a lot that I would like to add, but for sake of time, I'm only going to stop on one of the last questions that was posed, and then I will start with my presentation. In part to help you to understand the work that the World Bank has developed and what you will see next. I'm an economist, so a very different background than the previous presenters. At the World Bank, we focus on development and for us, and growth. And for us, we get to the issue of governance, poor governance and corruption, because we see it as an obstacle to growth and development. And lately, one of the objectives that our current president is emphasizing is fairness, equitable growth. Not just growth at a country level, growth for all the citizens, very equitable. And I wanted to emphasize this to explain a little bit of what we do. We focus often on the country as a whole, including many different stakeholders, as we call them in jargon, meaning the private sector, private citizen, the government. And here we think of government in a very broad sense. The executive, the legislative, the judiciary, local level government. And for us, it's very important to be able to think about issue of corruption in relation to all these different stakeholders, and when it manifests itself through the use of resources implemented by any of this level and group of government. Which one was the question that really piqued my interest? Something that was about education that our colleague from Jamaica raised. And I'm saying this because it was something that was emphasized a few months ago now in an event that was organized by my colleague Lisa Banzali, who is here sitting in the room, who is the governance advisor for Latin America. She organized an event for practitioners like yourself for Central America. And one of the suggestions that was repeated over and over 2 days discussion, was we need to go back and teach to our citizens, to our children, the importance of ethics. And it really resonated to me. There are a few examples. A colleague in Peru and Mexico, if my memory is not faulty, have been trying to address this through television and commercial spot. Some of them, and if my memory is correct, especially in Mexico, I think that there is a spot of a child sitting next to the father when he asked to pay a bribe, and the father thinking about it. Exactly thinking, which signal do you send to your children? There is a completely different approach that our colleague from Brazil could talk for hours. They have introduced the concept of ethics at every level of school, starting from primary school. An amazing effort. And also they do annual competition with children, trying to show what means to them this concept of ethics, being good citizen, and corruption. So there is so much that is happening, and is actually, I believe, an important piece of the conversation. So why was I asked to come here and talk? Because one of the things that we've done is something that is really, should be viewed as a resource for many of you. We work with government, and within government, because of the many anti-corruption conventions that a government sign or is in the process of signing, there are agency, unit, offices that are responsible for the implementation of this anti-corruption convention at the country level. We often bundle up all these offices under the terms of anti-corruption agency, commission, authority. And they've been mushrooming this agency, these authorities, over the past 10, 15 years, following the implementation and the signing of the UN Convention Against Corruption and the various other conventions. The reputation that some of these agencies have is to be have a very limited impact and effectiveness in the fight against corruption. So we started a few years ago and we posed ourselves the question, is that really the case? As I say, I'm an economist. I don't believe in someone telling me something. I need to see the evidence. So first question was, is really that the case? And if that is the case, which I couldn't believe, how can we support country, and specifically this type of teams and offices within the government, to become more effective? So what it is here today is the summary of what is available to all of you. We created a public portal that you can access, where we have collected information for about 68 anti-corruption agencies on a voluntary basis. This is an ongoing effort. Any of you that would like to have his agency represented here, contact myself or my colleague and we will add up the information. Each country will then have a page with a description of what the agency is doing. We have material information. We have e-learning accessible. And we also have some in-depth case studies of some agencies that are particularly interesting for what they have done in terms of being effective tools to reduce corruption in the country. As I say, this is an ongoing effort, and we make everything available to every practitioner, so not only to yourself, to researchers, to other people interested in this. And we do it because we believe that knowledge is actually our strongest tools in the fight against corruption. And this is one of the tools that we like to use. We will have not been able to do this without the support of the US State Department, who is a partner in this and has supported us all along in this effort. So let me quickly share with you some of the most interesting results that we found. As I say, everything is available. We often then, when colleagues like yourself come and visit the website, they then reach out to us and say, okay, we would like actually some advice on a specific issue about our agency, or we would like to understand how we can make it more effective. Is an issue in terms of resources, is an issue about the regulatory framework of the country, is an issue related to some of the way that we are planning and strategizing our work. And we, as much as possible, try to provide technical assistance to the agency that come to us with such a request. So let me quickly, as I say, the presentation is available, and I will actually try to quickly summarize it and then open the floor for discussion. So this is a little bit what I was saying in the introduction. How do we define an anti-corruption commission? What it is, an anti-corruption commission? And the brief history that these type of entities were very rare before, they existed, but they were rare before the introduction of this global or regional convention against corruption. In that sense, this convention created an environment where this agency mushroomed. The donor community support a lot of many of these agencies because they were seen as the first instrument to investigate, deter corruption, and to support the prevention of corruption. But after the first decade of effort, some researchers started to look. We invest so much resources, we support this agency. Are we really seeing something different? Has anything changed at the country level or at the global level? And the results were very, the impact was very limited across the board, with a very few exceptions. And so the question was why? Why those exceptions, and what can we learn? So for us, it really became an issue of, is there anything that we can learn so that will justify to support anti-corruption authority and make them an effective tool in the fight against corruption? And can we find out when is that the case? So we started very small. What did we do? This is the history of our work. We started about 4 years ago, and we gathered about 14 agencies, a few from Latin America, but in general it was a global event, closed door, however. And we really asked them over 2 days, what are your challenges? We are not going to share this information, but what are the real challenges that you face? Everybody talks in terms about the resources, limited capacity of the staff, limited capacity, limited reach, and complexity. That was the first layer. Then we started to go beyond that, and it became clear that there was also a challenge how to integrate the work of this team or agency within the country. And to gain the support of all the other government agencies that are needed to be able to achieve the objective of this. If you want to investigate a case on corruption, you cannot do it by yourself. You need the collaboration, the information, and the data from other agencies in the government. Potentially, you need information from other countries too. But let's start at home. And you need to be able to exchange information quickly and effectively. If you want to do prevention, you need to be able to understand which are the sectors that are high risk in your country. You need to have a good collaboration with other ministries. You need to think about how to reduce the risk within your public administration. If those linkages are not there, you can have all the resources and the stuff you want, but you will not be able to make progress. And we talked for about 2.5 days. And at the last day, the last layer came out. There was the issue of political interference. And I'm not saying anything that any of you will be surprised. Once you have resources, you operate in an environment that has a clear legal framework for you to operate. You have a good relationship with your colleague in other part of the government. You're always a potential victim of political interference when you start to investigate it or you start to change how resources and rents are distributed within a country. So slowly we realized that this agency, maybe they were not having the impact that they were expected to have, but there were a lot of good reasons. They were tasked to do something was incredibly difficult. And so how could we help them? These are the agencies that have responded to a brief survey, now are part of this website that we have created, the one in black. About 68 of them. The name on the top left in red, you cannot see it really in red, but on the top left, instead are agency, are country where we were able to do a more in-depth case studies, analyzing what was happening over a period of time of 5-10 years and what the agency did. To give you a sense of how we build this information, to make it useful also to all of you. So here were the challenges that this agency face. And the initial suggestion, the initial outcomes of those 2.5 days talking together was actually emphasized again and was reinforced when we start to talk to agency on indirect way. And we asked them, please tell us. We have a survey that is about 2 pieces of paper, 4 sheets, very quick to fill in. But we ask a very standardized question about some of this issue, and then we collect those information. And this is the result you're seeing. All report to have limited resources, staff that need more training, greater capacity. But they also struggle, this agency, the colleagues there, in terms of which strategy should we think of. When we think about the problem of corruption and we are given the mandate to operate within a system, how do we address that? Do we start to focus only on prevention? Or we start to investigate? And if we focus on investigation, do we focus on what they're called the big fish? That might create some repercussion and interference. Or we start instead focusing on the small fish. The other element that became very evident is that we are talking of an agency or a team that should show an impact. None of them had thought about how to measure and keep track of what they were doing. Very few. Beside number of publication and number of events that they were attending or number of investigation, something more concrete. Really to understand why it was important for them to be part of the government. And the other issue that is related to the, closely related, to the colleague in the panel that talked before, many of them struggle with this idea while the citizen, the private citizen, were there, open to have conversation, to support them. Many of them struggle to understand how to involve in their activity the private sector, the businesses. So they were operating without being able to have information, understanding of the challenges that businesses were facing in the country, and without being able to think together about solution. So one other thing that we learn is that I have used this very generic term of anti-corruption authority commission, but we realize that there are so many that you can really, we use almost incorrectly the terms. They have different mandate. Some of them only have a preventive mandate. They focus on the prevention. Some of them are instead focusing on deterrent and investigation. Some of them do all of it above. Others are an evolution of ombudsman offices. So you have such a diversity of agency that it becomes a little bit misleading to trying to evaluate them and just say, oh yeah, they don't work, because they have a very different mandate, function, and responsibility. So we start to separate and say, okay, if this is what you're supposed to do, this is the objective, then let's think about how you get there. It's also became very evident that some of the few cases that everybody mentioned when they think about Anti-Corruption Commission, Hong Kong, Singapore, they were so unique that could not be replicated in other countries for a variety of issues and a variety of reasons. You could learn something, but it was misleading to simply say, well, look, it worked there, let's take what has worked there, let's import it, and let's have it done, I don't know, in Peru. It was gonna work. It also became very clear that some of these agencies over time are changing. Some of them, I cannot think of a case in Latin America, but in other countries there are several cases. They started as very small offices, then they've been labeled agency. Their mandate was initially only outreach and information for citizens. Then they were given the mandate to focus on prevention of corruption. Then they start to investigate. And now they're also doing, they have a part of a role that usually was under the Ministry of Justice. So these agencies change over time. And when we think about how to support them, we need to think about a way to adapt our advice to what is needed at that point in time. And to have those cases written up, to be able to share to any of you, for us was very important. Because there is nothing, in my opinion, more valuable to learn from the story of someone else that have gone through. They maybe made some mistake, they had to struggle, to think about it and say, okay, this is something that we can really learn and adapt to our own reality. This is, unfortunately, is not relevant for us. This is another point that was very important for us to focus on. A lot of time when we think about anti-corruption, that we have a champion, we have a very good person, we have a very good team. They're going to go in, they're going to be given the power, the money, they're going to resolve anything. It doesn't matter what everybody else in the government, in the country is doing. And it doesn't matter whether this group of people, this agency, has any relationship or not with everybody else. And this is a mistake. You work together, you're trying to change a system. And to be able to change a system, you cannot do it in isolation, especially if you're really trying to change how the system is operating in a very profound way. So there are a few examples. A very excellent example of this is the Anti-Corruption Agency in Indonesia that has established working relationship with the central bank, with the commercial bank, with the agency in charge of all the land registry, with the agency in charge of passport and visa, agency in charge of driving license and registration of vehicle. Anytime that they have an issue, a question, they know immediately where to go, they know how to get the information, they know how to think together. They also have a working relationship with university, with the specific ministry that have asked for their input on how to strengthen how the ministry is working. Health, education, distribution of medicine at the local level. How should we think so we reduce corruption? So that allowed them to actually think, how do I solve a problem? I'm not just going after one person, I'm really trying to solve the problem. One issue that, however, is always present, but is present often in other areas, not just anti-corruption, is the fact that resources are limited. You have a limited amount of financial resources, and you have a limited amount of staff that has the appropriate training to be able to support the work of such agencies. So it's very important to actually be able to have those resources and to think about way when those resources are limited to actually to find solution. A colleague of us, not a World Bank colleague, an outside colleague from Argentina, in 2010 really struck a chord when he said, look, we had very little money, but what we will do with triage. So we will try to understand what we want to achieve, what makes sense to achieve in the next 12 months, in terms of which case to investigate, where do we need to create support, is there any specific sector that is very highly at risk, or there is some election coming up, can we think ahead and trying to do some initial screening, that's what he meant, and strategize. And that was his way to be able to manage a very large mandate with very little resources. It wasn't optimal, but it was a way, and it was very intelligent. And in that, and this linked me to something else, it was actually very important for him to communicate with citizens, and we will see why that is important. So resources are an issue. And the next issue that we discovered was a limit and a constraint was really the level of independence and the ability to operate that this agency will have. How can they operate and be fully in charge of what they're doing, not being influenced? You need a regulatory framework that protects them. But that's only the first step. You then need something else. To have the laws that guarantee, but not have them fully implemented, doesn't protect you. So here, also it was very important for us to think how of finding example of other countries that, despite the regulatory framework, they were able to survive very strong political pressure and to be able to actually carry out their work and make some progress. So here you have only two examples, and we have a long story written up that you can look at the website. Both Slovenia and Indonesia, the Commission, at a certain point in time, they were too close to the established power, and the government tried to remove the prime minister in both cases, trying to remove the head of the commission in Slovenia, couldn't. What helped, people took the street, but also the fact that the prime minister did not have the power to remove the head. It was a parliamentary committee. So you had this mechanism within the government, within the statute, that protect the head of the Anti-Corruption Commission. In the case of Indonesia, it was much more difficult. 3 of the then 9 anti-corruption commissioners were arrested overnight with fabricated charges. Here, what helped was the relationship that the agency had created with citizens. They communicated on a daily basis what they were doing and why they were doing it, and showing citizens, we are doing this for you. Overnight, they created a page on Facebook, and they had more than 1 million people signing up. They had to release them. They were still under arrest, but at least home arrest, which was a huge difference. And that shows also the importance, when you do this work, to communicate, to have this very good relationship with the people for whom you're working. Now, this is my last slide. What have we learned? This agency, when you think about corruption and tools that you have to address corruption, an anti-corruption agency can have an impact. But you have to be very careful what you're asking for. The agency has to operate in an environment where the legal framework is very clearly defined, has to have enough resources and capacity, has to be able to operate with all the other government, piece of the government. And here it goes back to something that someone before, and my apology, I can't remember which of you raised this issue, that you don't operate in a vacuum. There is how is the judiciary in the country? How are other parts of the government in the country? So it's very important that also we don't only look at the agency, but we think how to relate to the rest of the country. It's also very important that there is this link with the citizen of the country. And I will add something that I've learned recently, and I didn't have the time to add to this last slide. It's also important that you have a link with other practitioners, other agencies facing the same challenges. Because by sharing experiences and information, you can really try to improve the impact and the effect that you have. As I said, everything can be found on the web and more. You will receive this, so feel free to contact us for any clarification, any material. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, Francesca. Abrimos entonces la ronda de preguntas. República Dominicana.
Gracias, presidente. Qué bueno que soy el primero. Felicidades a la exponente del Banco Mundial sobre esta iniciativa tan interesante de autoridades anticorrupción. Me encantó sobre todo un punto que usted hacía referencia sobre la importancia de la independencia de la autoridad anticorrupción y sobre esa libertad de nombramiento y remoción de la máxima autoridad de esa institución a que nos referimos, que eso ha sido un tema de debate en los informes que hemos estado analizando en esta reunión. Me trajo muchos recuerdos de la obra de Bertrand de Espeville, Superando la corrupción, la presentación que usted hizo, que para nosotros es un libro de cabecera. Yo tenía una pregunta de si esta conferencia, esta información sobre estos principios, si ustedes tienen talleres customizados exclusivos para las instituciones públicas de diferentes países que se lo soliciten. Por ejemplo, en República Dominicana, para nosotros sería muy valioso predicar estos principios, esta estrategia sobre todo. Creo que sería de mucha ayuda para una institución como la que yo represento, que es la Dirección General de Ética e Integridad Gubernamental. Y bueno, me gustaría saber si ustedes tienen estos programas customizados para los países miembros de este comité, si pudiera ser, y a través de quién se hace el contacto. Gracias.
Gracias, República Dominicana. Haití, por favor. Vamos a hacer igual, ¿no? Recolectamos 3 preguntas y pasamos a la respuesta. Haití, por favor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Parlant de l'impact des résultats des agences anticorruption, la distinguée représentante de la banque a indiqué que les résultats de l'enquête a révélé que les résultats sont maigres. Je me dis que sans doute ces résultats doivent être probablement les critères choisis pour les évaluer, c'est des critères objectifs comme le nombre peut-être de condamnations, des résultats plutôt chiffrés. Mais je me demande s'il faut, si ça a été le cas, se baser uniquement sur des résultats chiffrés quantifiables pour évaluer les résultats d'une agence anticorruption. Dans mon pays, ceci est arrivé après 10 ans d'action. L'unité anticorruption n'arrive pas à avoir vraiment un cas de condamnation et la paralysie vient du système judiciaire. Et si nous devions nous baser sur ça, eh bien, le découragement aurait pu nous emporter et dire qu'il faut passer la clé sous la porte et aller faire autre chose. Et par contre, il y a d'autres résultats qui nous encouragent. Par exemple, la corruption était considérée comme un fait normal, on vivait avec jusqu'à la création de l'unité, mais aujourd'hui, la corruption est dénoncée sur tous les toits, c'est dénoncé partout. Il est vrai qu'il n'y a pas encore de résultats, mais on s'est dit que là, de ce côté, il y a quand même quelque chose d'encourageant. Et ceci est consécutif à une campagne que nous avons menée dans le pays pour montrer que la corruption a des effets vraiment négatifs sur l'évolution de la société, notamment sur la situation des plus pauvres. La corruption, c'est en quelque sorte une taxe qui pèse sur les plus pauvres de la société. Je voudrais une clarification sur un concept utilisé ici, le concept de croissance équitable. Évidemment, je ne suis pas économiste, mais je savais entendre parler dans le temps de répartition équitable de la croissance, mais est-ce que la croissance équitable, ça équivaut à la répartition de la croissance? Je vous remercie.
Gracias, Haití. Venezuela, por favor.
Gracias, señor presidente. Muy importante la exposición de Francesca, muy agradecida por todas estas orientaciones. Tenemos un planteamiento, primero que Venezuela, pues, dentro de todo este proceso de cambio que está viviendo, ha tenido muchas reservas en cuanto a los organismos multilaterales y la forma de ayudarnos y toda la experiencia tan dura que pasamos de tanta cantidad de dinero otorgada en préstamos que no resolvieron el problema de nuestro pueblo y bueno, arrastramos todo esto todavía con mucha crisis, ¿no? Pero el elemento importante en este trabajo que veo del Banco Mundial, que diferencia un poco lo que venía haciendo el Banco Interamericano, que también tiene una experiencia donde un colega experto de acá del MESISIC hizo un trabajo, Nicolás Dassen, ¿no? Nicolás Dassen, hicieron un trabajo especialísimo y con una modalidad de sanción a empresas, a órganos, a entes y a personas que fueron inhabilitadas para poder tramitar o ser beneficiarios de préstamos y ha sido una experiencia pues bastante positiva y por supuesto ha tenido rechazos en muchos países, pero creemos que era importante hacerlo y que dio un sacudón a nivel de estos organismos internacionales. Y el caso de Venezuela nos interesa muchísimo porque no solo porque estamos integrados ahora a constituir nuevos organismos internacionales, sino que también a través de los países miembros del Mercosur y estamos creando un Banco del Sur, lo importante es que estas instituciones tengan una orientación de los mayores que ya han transitado por todo aquello. Entonces, una parte muy delicada tiene que ver con la independencia de la autoridad y el impacto político de las decisiones del trabajo que se hacen en lucha anticorrupción. En el caso particular de Venezuela, el organismo que más trabaja el tema desde el punto de vista institucional es la Contraloría General de la República, que forma parte de un poder separado, como creación de nuestra Constitución, del llamado poder ciudadano, y se hace un trabajo. Y allí está una competencia con el poder político, porque el Parlamento tiene una comisión de Contraloría y pues donde no tienes que seguir una metodología como el de un auditor para poder dar un resultado, haces una apreciación y declaras desde el punto de vista político una responsabilidad política que no necesariamente sirve de base para una responsabilidad administrativa, una declaratoria de responsabilidad, una sanción de inhabilitación o de destitución. Entonces, esa independencia para esos organismos, más o menos en el tema que planteaba también Haití, y tomando en cuenta la experiencia venezolana, ¿qué tienen ustedes como referencia en otros países? ¿Cómo integrar una institución que pueda velar por ese trabajo de lucha anticorrupción, pero que pueda tener minimizado el impacto político? Tomando en cuenta fundamentalmente, y si lo enfocamos a la creación del Banco del Sur, ¿no?, ¿qué están haciendo? Y qué es la oportunidad de que los países que allí estamos podamos tener una guía para orientar a nuestros gobiernos en buenas prácticas y tratar de llevar medición desde el nacimiento de la institución, que tiene pues fines similares a los del Banco Mundial para el desarrollo de nuestras regiones y de nuestros países. Gracias.
Perú, por favor.
Sí, muchas gracias, presidente, y felicitaciones a Francesca por su presentación. Preguntas muy puntuales. Una primera es si es que este estudio que ha realizado el Banco Mundial se puede acceder a todo el estudio, está disponible. Ya, y está me imagino, se puede acceder, ahí está. Ya, es que pensé que a lo que se podía acceder vía esto era solamente a la presentación. No me quedaba claro. Ya. Segundo, lo que quisiera preguntarle es cómo se ha definido a las agencias anticorrupción. O sea, ¿cuál es el punto de partida? Porque agencias anticorrupción, esa definición recae, de acuerdo a lo que yo he visto en distintos países, no solamente a las comisiones, consejos creados de manera ad hoc para combatir la corrupción, sino también inclusive a Poder Judicial, Ministerio Público, Contraloría, absolutamente todas ellas. Entonces, no me queda claro si es que esta evaluación de las agencias anticorrupción incluye de manera indistinta a todas y si es que de esa manera es que se ha hecho la evaluación de su impacto y esas recomendaciones van también formuladas en esa línea. Porque si estamos hablando de las agencias anticorrupción, que son concebidas más como espacios de articulación de esfuerzos, como lo es la Comisión de Alto Nivel Anticorrupción, de la cual yo soy secretaria ejecutiva, un elemento indispensable me parece que debería estar dentro de las recomendaciones de temas que tienen que estar presentes, además de la independencia y la voluntad política, la capacidad de coordinación y articulación, ¿no? Porque cuando se tiene un espacio en el que en el que confluyen Poder Judicial, Ministerio Público, Contralorías y otras procuradurías, en fin, se requiere de un elemento fundamental que es el de la coordinación, ¿no? Y finalmente, lo último, ¿cuáles han sido, de manera clara, o si es que está en el informe, de todas maneras lo voy a revisar, los indicadores, cómo se han formulado los indicadores de medición del éxito de estas agencias anticorrupción? Gracias.
Vamos a responder ahora las preguntas y Antigua y Barbuda lo haría después de... Porque ya son varias, pensamos que terminábamos con Perú. Pero entonces vamos a pasar a Francesca, por favor, para que responda. Y luego recibimos la pregunta de Antigua y Barbuda. Por favor, Francesca.
Let me see if I can respond quickly, because one thing that I should start my presentation with should be the thanks and acknowledgement that the colleague from Brazil agreed to switch with me because I have another meeting after this and they let me go first, but now I feel I'm using all their time. So, so let me start with that. I'm very conscious of the time. Let me group questions. So some of you were talking about the role of the independence and how important it is for this agency to be independent. The way that we have been starting to think about this is to first look, for example, how the head of the agency is appointed. First step. Second step, who can remove it? Third step, to whom he reports to or she reports to. The three are very separate line of authority. And what we have seen is that in countries where these lines are not blurred together, the power is not of the same one person to appoint, remove, and the reporting line only to the president of the country, to the prime minister, where these instead are in three different parts, you have a way to protect and guarantee a certain degree of independence. First point. And this is something that we have been able to see systematically. And it's quite important. We have a few experiences that I was describing before very quickly, that of country where this issue of the interference and attack to the independence was much more significant. And we have collected in case studies. But one point that I wanted to emphasize, we often talk about independence of this agency, but the other side of the coin is the performance of the agency. I'm very much in support of this agency to be independent, but that should not be the case without this agency then showing how they're using the resources that they've been given, what is that they are achieving, and have the two sides of the coin is that you're independent in your mandate, in carry out your mandate, but at the same time, you're accountable for the public resources you've been given and the decision. And I think that this is the other side that we've been trying to push. Related to this, because if we think about accountability and then this concept that economists like of performance, let me do a clarification. The World Bank did not do an evaluation of the agency. We looked at what was present by other researchers, and here they use a lot of indicators that are imperfect, and imperfect for a variety of reasons. They often look at the evolution of the Transparency International Index, which has nothing to do with what an anti-corruption agency might be doing in the country. So it was the wrong indicator to look at to measure the agency. Or they look at conviction rate, but the agency maybe didn't even have that power. They were given the mandate to coordinate and to do prevention. So how could you evaluate them? So we started to think also, and this is another part of our effort that we are doing with other colleagues that are not here today, how can we think about measuring the performance? And here we are collecting information from all of you. Are you doing it? And how are you doing it? Can you give us some idea, some good idea, things that you learned that definitely nobody else should try? You know, a lot of time is very good to learn from mistake and to communicate the mistake and say, don't go down the same path. So in that sense, I think that it's very important to clarify that we didn't do an evaluation. And related to that, the point that our colleague from Peru was suggesting, when we think about anti-corruption agency, we were doing it looking at the various international convention that the country has to sign, and the definition that is within those conventions. So in your case, your agency will fit under this, because we look at the Article 6 and 14, I believe, of the UNCAC, for example. Thank you, 6 and 36, that looks at and define. It will also be is whoever has the mandate and is to simplify it, is the focal point for the implementation of that special convention in that country, right? So in that sense, I think that is very important that to also have an understanding, like you're suggesting, and you raise a very good point about the coordination, which is something that increasingly we are hearing from others. The other issue about very quick response, we do, and here my colleague Lisa Banzali can tell you, we do and try to offer as much as possible specific, we call it technical assistance, capacity, training, to different countries, either when they have ad hoc question, challenges. Some countries right now are coming to me because this agency have to implement the income and asset disclosure legislation, and they don't have the capacity, how to handle it, how to manage, how to verify it, how to systematize this, or how to do outreach to citizens, how to think about some high sector with high risk of corruption, how do we think about that? Or we do some of this informative. The event I was mentioning before that was done in Guatemala last May was exactly done with this idea. How do we share the knowledge that we have and we make it much more available to all of you? All this information, it's here and is available, and I'm sure that both Lisa and I can talk for days about activity, and we can think and trying to adapt it. The last question that was raised was about what is the relationship between equitable growth and corruption. Corruption is an abuse of power. And in that sense, I am very glad that you raise an issue that I've seen over and over. The other thing that I do often, I help countries to collect data, very, very detailed data like the one that was done in Peru on the cost of corruption for citizens and businesses. And you are right, thank you for raising that. Corruption is a regressive tax. It penalizes more poorer citizens, and it penalizes more small businesses. And for us, it's very important, therefore, to be able to protect the poorer citizen and the small businesses that often in many countries, they are supposed to be the engine of growth. So that's how we link equitable growth with corruption. Thank you.
Gracias. Vamos a dar la palabra a Antigua y Barbuda y luego a Uruguay. Con esto cerramos las preguntas. Por favor, ser muy concretos porque queremos tener alcanzar a tener la presentación de Brasil y también que puedan existir preguntas en esa presentación. Por favor.
I actually just now only have a comment because you've answered most of my, well, the questions that I had. But what I wanted to say was thank you very much for your presentation. It actually could not come at a better time because Antigua and Barbuda, we're just about to try to set up our anti-corruption agency. And it's going to cabinet next week. But we've been grappling with the idea, with the thoughts of how it's going to be structured, what's the best way to do it for us to start, start out now, given the limited resources and funding. But it's something that the island wants to do because they reckon it has to be done, given the fact that we now have a new administration in power and one of their mandates is anti-corruption. And the fact that the Citizen by Investment Program is supposed to be a source of helping the economy to grow. So your comments, your thoughts, your information could not come at a better time. Thank you.
Gracias, Antigua y Barbuda, Uruguay.
Antes que nada, darle la bienvenida a Renata, que hace ya 6 meses que la estamos esperando, que por suerte no hubo nevada esta semana y pudo concurrir. No sé si recuerdan algunos que estaba prevista para marzo y en la nieve impidió que llegara hasta acá. Muy brevemente, es agregar un punto que tú tocaste referente a la independencia de las agencias o de los organismos encargados de anticorrupción, y tú nombraste 3 elementos fundamentales. ¿Quién nombra, quién destituye y ante quién rinde cuentas? Yo creo que faltó uno, si me permitís. Faltó la ubicación institucional. Según me enseñó nuestro querido amigo Néstor Baragli de Argentina, en un trabajo publicado hace unos cuantos años, no sé si se modificó, se fue actualizado, no existe ninguna agencia en Latinoamérica que sea independiente del poder político. Y eso es importante. Es muy importante la ubicación, tanto como a quién rinde cuentas o quién lo nombra o quién lo destituye. Entonces, Uruguay, por ejemplo, lo nombra el presidente en Consejo de Ministros con venia del Senado. Para destituirlo se precisa decisión del presidente en Consejo de Ministros con venia del Senado, de 2/3. Y rinde cuentas al Poder Legislativo, al Poder Judicial y al Poder Ejecutivo. Pero su ubicación está dentro del Ministerio de Educación y Cultura, de modo tal que somos administrativamente dependientes del Poder Ejecutivo y técnicamente independientes, de derecha técnica, lo cual me parece que eso es muy importante, tener en cuenta la ubicación. Nosotros hace 2 años estamos luchando por una norma legal de que nos aleje del Poder Ejecutivo y nos nombre un tipo de ente autónomo, una autarquía independiente. Pero seríamos, reitero, la única que hay en América. Esa norma está pronta, se va a presentar y esperemos que sea antes de nuestro mandato. Quería agregar eso simplemente y muchas gracias por tu presencia.
Gracias, Uruguay. Y me voy a permitir un pequeño comentario. En el Ecuador, de hecho, la institución, la Autoridad Anticorrupción, el Consejo de Participación Ciudadana, es parte de una 5ª función del Estado. Fuera del Ejecutivo, no sé... bueno, pero como usted lo comentó. Sí, bueno, esto es de hecho desde el 2008, es una entidad creada por la nueva Constitución del 2008. Se la elige por concurso, sus consejeros se eligen por concurso de méritos de oposición, y el concurso lo hace la función electoral. En el Ecuador tenemos 5 funciones ahora, las 3 de siempre, la electoral y la de función de transparencia y control social. Solo como comentario extra, 1000 disculpas. Por favor, Francesca.
I was going to answer. Thank you. I think that actually this is why I keep on trying to reach out and to learn more. What you have seen is a summary of what you all have done, but it's not work that we have done. So in the sense, we have only summarized what you have tried and what you have learned. And we need more of this input. And that's what I keep on saying, this is work in progress. I'm very happy that we can provide any comments, guidance, and advice. And I'm very happy to hear that there are new ideas coming up and new models that we can look at it and we can share. As you keep in mind that we operate globally. And now we are also operating with European countries, because they are starting to look up at the World Bank as a knowledge bank. And so when it comes to Anti-Corruption Commission, we are actually starting to advise also European countries that we have not done in the past. And this is very important because this is a problem that all of us have to tackle with. So I will follow up directly with some of you because I wanted to make sure that we update. But please feel free to reach out to me and to Liz and to all our colleagues. If we don't have the answer, we will make sure that you have the answer. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Francesca, por tu tiempo, por tu presentación. Voy a pedir también un aplauso, por favor, para Francesca. Continuaríamos con la presentación de Brasil. Compañeras y compañeros, vamos a dar inicio a la presentación por parte de la Delegación de Brasil, la cooperación internacional no penal en el combate contra la corrupción. Por favor, Brasil, cuando guste.
Muito obrigada, senhor presidente. Antes de tudo, eu gostaria de agradecer ao secretariado e ao próprio comitê por nos permitir esse espaço para falar de um tema que é tão caro atualmente para o Brasil, qual seja a dos mecanismos não criminais de enfrentamento à corrupção e a cooperação jurídica internacional, que esperamos que se possa obter no âmbito desses mesmos instrumentos não criminais de persecução à corrupção. Eu prometo não vou tomar muito tempo de vocês. A ideia mesmo do Brasil em trazer esse tema para o comitê é lançarmos base para que ele possa ser melhor aproveitado, melhor debatido, quem sabe como um dos temas de interesse coletivo do próximo ano, já que a gente está no momento de aprovação do plano de trabalho de 2015, partindo do pressuposto de que esse não é um problema só do Brasil, mas, quem sabe, de outros países que aqui também estão representados. A ideia, então, é mesmo promover a troca de experiências, conhecer mesmo a realidade de cada um dos países e saber da importância que tem esses instrumentos não criminais para cada uma das nossas jurisdições. Como foi o passado? Aqui? Bueno, gracias. Como todos os senhores sabem até melhor que eu, historicamente a maioria dos países adotaram ou tem adotado preponderantemente mecanismos de natureza criminal para investigação e persecução da corrupção. Isso, de certa forma, está refletido em todas as convenções, ou pelo menos as principais convenções internacionais que cobrem o tema aqui na região, e não seria diferente com a nossa própria Convenção Interamericana de Combate à Corrupção. Mas é verdade também que, recentemente, talvez mais recentemente para alguns países, menos recentemente para outros, algumas mudanças legislativas se operaram de maneira muito preponderante em alguns países aqui da América do Sul, e alguns instrumentos de natureza não criminal passaram também a ocupar um papel relevante nessa ação, nessa dinâmica de enfrentamento à corrupção, do que é exemplo, claro, a recém-aprovada Lei Anticorrupção no Brasil, que estabelece todo um sistema não criminal de enfrentamento à corrupção, mas que nos dá aí às autoridades brasileiras, às autoridades do governo de persecução, um bom instrumento de combate à corrupção, assim como os já existentes em matéria criminal. Então, essa, eu imagino, não seja uma situação isolada. Nós conhecemos várias legislações, algumas mais antigas, repito, outras mais novas, mas que também trazem essa inovação, ou pelo menos essa peculiaridade de não ter necessariamente a sua natureza ligada a um ato criminal ou a um instrumento criminal. Esse quadro, na verdade, a gente tirou ele de um estudo que ainda está em andamento no âmbito do Banco Mundial. Ele traz as principais diferenças do que seria um instrumento criminal de persecução à corrupção e um instrumento de natureza não criminal. É claro que tem diferenças importantes, diferenças estruturais no que diz respeito ao que, por exemplo, cada um dos mecanismos tem por fim, tem por objetivo macro, tem inclusive no que diz respeito à cobertura das suas penas previstas. É claro que todos os senhores sabem que os procedimentos criminais têm como um dos seus viés principais buscar a prisão das pessoas que estão envolvidas naquele procedimento, enquanto que o civil administrativo tem todo um caráter em termos de multa e de penalidades monetárias mesmo, que talvez não estejam tão presentes, ou que talvez não seja o principal objetivo no que se refere aos mecanismos criminais. Tem também a diferença no que diz respeito à fonte de obrigação. Normalmente, os procedimentos de natureza criminais, eles têm que ter como base legal uma lei escrita, ou pelo menos isso é o que é a realidade que se verifica na grande maioria dos países aqui da América do Sul, ao passo que os procedimentos civis e administrativos têm como base tanto leis escritas, mas também regulações e, muitas vezes, precedentes de jurisprudência. Uma outra diferença também, que nesse estudo do Banco Mundial ficou muito claro em relação aos procedimentos de natureza não criminal, ou seja, os procedimentos civis e administrativos, estão muito relacionados ao padrão de prova. Eu não sei qual exatamente seria a tradução para o português dessa expressão, mas, normalmente, os procedimentos criminais envolvem um padrão necessário de prova um tanto quanto maior que aqueles de natureza não criminal e natureza civil ou administrativa. Isso tem pautado, é verdade, a decisão de alguns estados exatamente em buscar esses instrumentos alternativos ao criminal, exatamente por perceber que é mais efetivo, é mais prático você buscar essa persecução que talvez não tenha um standard of proof, me utilizando aí da expressão em inglês, tão alta quanto tem esses procedimentos criminais, exatamente pelo motivo que eu mencionei anteriormente, porque envolve naturalmente, ou pelo menos na maioria das vezes, envolve direitos muito caros, qual seja, por exemplo, a liberdade de um indivíduo. E aqui eu trouxe alguns exemplos de exitosos no Brasil, e eu tenho certeza que, na verdade, são exemplos mesmo, e que eles se replicam, muito provavelmente, na grande maioria dos países aqui, de procedimentos que não têm um viés necessariamente criminal, mas que foram bem-sucedidos no que diz respeito ao enfrentamento à corrupção interna no Brasil. E aqui, a título meramente exemplificativa. A gente trouxe alguns dados no que diz respeito a sanções expulsivas de funcionários públicos. A gente tem uma taxa baixa de reversão dessas demissões no Poder Judiciário, o que também indica um certo sucesso dos procedimentos não criminais. Eu não sei se essas traduções são as mais corretas, mas a gente tem que, num total, o número de 4.938 funcionários públicos demitidos pela CGU, sendo que, nesse número total, 67,4% corresponde a atos de corrupção, ou seja, 67% de 4.938 funcionários foram afastados pela CGU por terem cometido atos de corrupção. E dessas decisões, somente 6,58% sofreu uma revisão por parte do Judiciário. Isso indica uma certa assertividade dos procedimentos de natureza não criminal que estão sendo levados a cabo no âmbito da administração pública brasileira. E, repito, aqui é mais um exemplo, na verdade, da importância desses instrumentos não criminais no Brasil, do que eu imagino que seja replicado também na grande maioria dos países dos senhores. Também, de maneira mais elucidativa do problema que a gente levanta aqui, a gente trouxe alguns dados relativos ao que a gente chama, no Brasil, de ação de improbidade administrativa. Essa é uma ação tanto quanto peculiar do Brasil, mas eu imagino que alguns dos senhores já tenham familiaridade com esse nosso instrumento, mas, de maneira muito geral, é um instrumento que visa a persecução de funcionários públicos que cometem atos ilícitos contra a administração pública, em um âmbito não criminal, repito, no âmbito civil, e esse é um dado que, na verdade, ele é bastante elucidativo de um segundo problema que a gente gostaria de levantar aqui, que é exatamente a questão da cooperação jurídica internacional no âmbito desses procedimentos. Em 2013, o Estado, né, o Brasil, ele demandou ele apareceu como demandante principal, digamos assim, em 82 ações de improbidade administrativa que envolvem um valor de aproximadamente 10 milhões de dólares. Sendo o Estado assistente, ou seja, sendo ele mais um demandante, foram 105 ações que envolvem um valor total de 76 milhões 471 de dólares. Esses valores, senhores, são valores que estão envolvidos nas ações de que participa o Estado na persecução da improbidade administrativa. Percebam que esse não é o valor que nós recuperamos. E aqui, na verdade, é a grande questão. Esse, infelizmente, ainda é um valor muito distante do que a gente efetivamente tem recuperado. E o Brasil entende, o Brasil tem a percepção de que grande parte desse problema se deve exatamente talvez não tão falta de fluidez mesmo no que diz respeito à cooperação jurídica internacional para esses procedimentos. Uma cooperação que nos permita não só localizar bens no exterior, uma cooperação que nos permita obter depoimentos no exterior, mas uma cooperação até mais a fundo e até um pouco mais a exemplo do que a gente tem para a área criminal hoje, que nos permita congelar bens no exterior, que nos permita confiscar esses bens no exterior e, quem sabe, até repatriar esses bens para o Estado vítima. Então, a gente trouxe esses números aqui exatamente para deixar de maneira muito elucidativa os valores que estão envolvidos, mas não necessariamente recuperados para o erário público. O que o Brasil tem feito, tem lançado mão atualmente, na verdade já faz um tempo, para tentar compensar essa ausência de fluidez dos canais de cooperação em matéria não criminal, é a contratação de advogados no exterior. Mas entendo que esse, na verdade, nem sempre é um passo válido em termos financeiros, mesmo para o Estado. Nós gastamos um valor considerável com advogados no exterior, simplesmente pelo fato de não termos das nossas contrapartes a possibilidade de uma prestação de cooperação interestatal. E muitas vezes isso não compensa, como eu falei, muitas vezes a gente acaba gastando mais dinheiro com advogado no exterior que propriamente recuperando, no final, aquele valor que foi indevidamente desviado da nossa administração pública brasileira. Aqui mais um dado, vocês percebem que a gente teve, em relação a 2013 especificamente, tendo a União como demandante em ações de recuperação de ativos, não necessariamente somente de improbidade administrativa, mas percebo que a gente ainda está, em relação ao que a gente promoveu de retorno, de ingresso em 2013, a gente ainda tem um valor muito baixo no que diz respeito ao valor total das ações que foram promovidas. E, repito, a nossa percepção é a de que, como grande parte desses valores, isso eu acredito que não seja novidade para ninguém aqui, é ilicitamente encaminhado para o exterior, nessas ações, o componente cooperação internacional tem um valor extremamente importante. Uma vez que a cooperação não é possível para esse tipo de procedimento, a gente tem uma perda enorme. Aqui eu trouxe um quadro que demonstra quem são os principais réus, digamos assim, nessas ações que o Estado promove para recuperar ativos. Percebo que as pessoas jurídicas estão em terceiro lugar. E, mais uma vez, aqui a nossa percepção é de que ela, na verdade, deveria figurar em primeiro lugar. Mas, normalmente, essas empresas envolvem uma consultoria jurídica extremamente sofisticada, que muitas vezes também acabam resultando em remessas ilegais para o exterior. Então, mais uma vez, a gente tem aqui a nossa continuidade dos nossos processos prejudicada porque esbarramos na falta de possibilidade de obtermos cooperação no exterior para esse tipo de ação em matéria não criminal. Aqui é só um exemplo, na verdade, a gente tem do que a gente pode fazer, o que a gente tem feito internamente nesses procedimentos. Todo procedimento no Brasil, seja judicial, seja administrativo, que gera uma penalização para uma empresa, faz com que essa empresa seja incluída nesse nosso registro, que atualmente conta com o número de 9.785 empresas, que uma vez estando nesses registros, essas empresas elas estão privadas de contratar com o governo. Nosso trabalho é no sentido de que todas as entidades, inclusive em nível local, consultem esse registro antes de contratar com o governo, para saber se aquela empresa com quem ela está pretendendo contratar não está incluída no registro. E aqui é só um exemplo de empresas que, em âmbito de um procedimento administrativo ou em âmbito de um procedimento civil, ou seja, não criminal, sofreram condenações e, por isso, não podem contratar com o governo. Mas, certamente, esses mesmos procedimentos envolveram um braço internacional, pelo menos a grande maioria dele, cuja continuidade não se pôde dar, porque a gente sabe que vários países têm mesmo limitações legais que os impedem, ainda existe essa vontade por parte desses países, mas que tem procedimentos, inclusive, muitas vezes constitucionais, que os impedem de prover uma maior cooperação para esses procedimentos não criminais. Aqui alguns exemplos só de empresas. As nossas convenções, ou pelo menos de que são parte a maioria dos países aqui presentes, nos dão um certo embasamento jurídico. É claro que todas elas, como eu falei no início, e os senhores sabem muito bem, são muito focadas em aspectos criminais, né? São muito focadas na obrigação dos Estados tipificarem como condutas criminais aquele rol de condutas que elas trazem ali no seu âmbito. Mas já há um espaço, pelo menos na maioria delas, nas principais delas, tirando a nossa própria, já há um espaço que sinaliza para essa possibilidade da responsabilização não criminal, principalmente no que diz respeito às pessoas jurídicas, né? A gente tem aí o exemplo da própria UNCAC, no artigo 26, que abre essa possibilidade, né, para que os Estados pensem também naqueles que não é possível a penalização penal das pessoas jurídicas, que os façam, pelo menos em âmbito civil ou administrativamente. A própria convenção da OCDE, que, claro, mais uma vez, deixa clara a sua preferência pela responsabilização criminal da pessoa jurídica, mas que mas incita os países também a promover a responsabilização administrativa ou civil dessas mesmas pessoas jurídicas. E isso, na verdade, em relação a trazer um exemplo para o Brasil, acabou gerando uma lei de responsabilização da pessoa jurídica no Brasil. E aí, repito, eu imagino que, na verdade, esse é um exemplo de algumas outras legislações bastante importantes nessa mesma matéria que têm surgido, que continuam surgindo aqui na região, no que diz respeito à responsabilização da pessoa jurídica em matéria civil e administrativa. A gente recém aprovou essa lei, imagino que vocês já tenham familiaridade com ela, até porque já foi objeto de uma apresentação prévia aqui no comitê, mas só retomando alguns aspectos importantes dela, ela traz essa responsabilização objetiva das empresas que são envolvidas em atos de corrupção, ou seja, o que a gente chama na lei de atos lesivos contra a administração pública nacional ou estrangeira, em cumprimento à Convenção da OCDE. Esses atos lesivos a lei traz como promessa, oferecimento ou concessão de qualquer vantagem devida a um funcionário público, fraudes e irregularidades relacionadas a licitações, ou mesmo atividades que tentam obstacularizar as atividades e operações de investigação. Traz um rol de sanções considerável, né, possíveis de serem aplicadas a essas empresas, repito, em âmbito administrativo e em âmbito civil. E traz para a competência da CGU, no caso do Brasil, a jurisdição concorrente em relação aos casos de corrupção interna e a jurisdição exclusiva no caso de atos cometidos por essas empresas contra funcionários públicos estrangeiros. E aqui fica, mais uma vez, muito clara a necessidade de que a gente, pelo menos, e é o que a gente tentado trabalhar nos outros fóruns, a necessidade de que haja mesmo um alargamento, ou que a gente comece mesmo a conversar sobre canais de cooperação em matéria não criminal, ou pelo menos que os atuais canais que existem para matéria não criminal também repliquem os padrões que hoje a gente tem para a matéria criminal, né? A gente tem, de fato, canais um pouco mais ortodoxos hoje em dia para a cooperação em matéria não criminal, e seria desejável que, para a aplicação de marcos jurídicos como esse aqui, do que esse aqui é exemplo, a gente tenha mesmo um alargamento no que diz respeito à cooperação para esse tipo de procedimento. Essa cooperação, como eu mencionei, ela vai ser importante para localizar pessoas, documentos, identificar, bloquear bens no exterior e até promover a repatriação desses bens. A gente percebe que a dificuldade atualmente é muito pela novidade do tema da cooperação em matéria não criminal e pela ausência também de marcos regulatórios mais específicos. E isso, na verdade, pode ser melhor trabalhado, já que a gente tem também uma base, ainda que incipiente, mas que nos permite começar com esse trabalho na própria UNCAC, que fala dessa possibilidade dos países cooperarem, ainda que em matéria não criminal, né? E a própria Convenção da OCDE, que também abre esse espaço aí, pelo menos inicia essa possibilidade dos países passarem também a ter no seu radar de preocupações essa cooperação para fins não criminais, ou pelo menos para a instrução de procedimentos não criminais necessariamente. A nossa convenção, ela, apesar de não trazer expressamente essa possibilidade, como os senhores bem sabem, ou seja, a possibilidade dos países cooperarem com base nela para fins não criminais, ela abre também um certo espaço na medida em que ela prevê no artigo 20 que nenhum daqueles dispositivos ali poderá ser interpretado de maneira a restringir outros acordos bilaterais ou multilaterais que sejam. Por fim, eu só gostaria de informá-los que essa atividade, que essa iniciativa que a gente está tendo aqui, ela, na verdade, também foi realizada em alguns outros fóruns internacionais que têm competência nessa matéria de enfrentamento à corrupção. O Brasil vem mesmo muito por ocasião da aprovação dessa nova lei, mas percebendo também que esse é um problema que tangencia outros países. A gente vem realmente tentando desenvolver esse tema em outros fóruns internacionais. Em alguns, a gente já, inclusive, circulou alguns questionários que já foram respondidos por um número considerável de países e que sinalizam, de fato, infelizmente, pela impossibilidade de grande parte desses mesmos países cooperarem para fins não criminais, seja por questões legais, seja porque simplesmente não há naqueles países procedimentos não criminais de enfrentamento à corrupção, ou seja por questões diversas. Então, fica aqui a nossa sugestão para que esse seja um tema que continue no radar de preocupação do mecanismo, que a gente reconheça que existem procedimentos importantes que não estão necessariamente vinculados a uma natureza criminal, mas que são igualmente importantes importantes em matéria de persecução à corrupção e que a gente possa, então, trocar experiências nesse sentido e, se for o caso, pensar em boas práticas e, quem sabe, até evoluir para uma coisa um pouco mais arrojada no futuro, ainda que a médio, a longo prazo, no sentido de promover um acordo, enfim, e aí pensando de uma maneira um pouco mais ambiciosa, né? No mais, muitíssimo obrigada pela paciência e peço desculpa por prendê-los um pouco mais aqui nessa tarde.
Muchísimas gracias, Camila, representante de Brasil. Sin duda es un tema bastante nuevo aún y aplaudimos la iniciativa. Sí pueden preguntar, todavía tenemos unos minutos. Haití, por favor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. En 2012-2013, Haïti a eu l'opportunité d'évaluer conjointement avec le Mexique l'application de, je crois, 2 chapitres de la Convention des Nations Unies contre la corruption. Et nous avons pu remarquer que le Brésil était conforme avec le chapitre 3 en grande partie qui traite de la criminalisation. Mais nous savons aussi que le Brésil dispose d'une loi à caractère administratif qui lui donne cette flexibilité de pouvoir poursuivre au pénal ou sur le plan administratif. La question maintenant que nous posons est de savoir est-ce que l'application de ces dispositions d'ordre administratif, est-ce que ça donne des résultats vraiment probants, auquel cas ce serait vraiment une bonne pratique à implémenter par les autres pays de la région. L'autre question que je voulais poser, ça concerne les personnes physiques qui sont renvoyées de l'administration. Est-ce qu'ils sont renvoyés de façon temporaire, définitive, ou comment est-ce qu'ils n'ont pas la possibilité de réintégrer l'administration publique?
Em relação à primeira pergunta, sim, a gente tem alguns bons exemplos de persecução administrativa, a corrupção, administrativa ou leis, na verdade, não criminal, porque a gente tem essas duas possibilidades, que é a administrativa puramente, mas aquela possibilidade também de algum procedimento que vai para a corte, mas que não é criminal, que a gente chama de civil. A gente tem bons resultados nessas duas áreas, do que exemplo alguns dos que eu mostrei aqui anteriormente, mas, como eu mencionei, a nossa grande barreira, e imagino que não estejamos isolados nesse sentido, a nossa grande barreira é exatamente quando algum desses procedimentos, e isso não raramente acontece, principalmente nos grandes casos de corrupção, quando algum desses procedimentos tem algum dos seus medidas para serem executadas no exterior. Então, o senhor deve saber tanto bem quanto eu que os casos de corrupção de médio a grande porte normalmente envolvem outras jurisdições. E aí, consequentemente, você precisa da cooperação dessas outras jurisdições para poder dar seguimento ao seu procedimento interno. Então, nossos casos de bem-sucedidos, eles vão até o momento em que esses mesmos procedimentos não precisam de atos no exterior. E aí, infelizmente, isso só acaba cobrindo casos que a gente considera menores de corrupção. Mas, realmente, infelizmente, no que diz respeito aos casos maiores e que a gente tem que buscar alguma coisa em outras jurisdições, em regra, infelizmente, para esses procedimentos não criminais, a gente não tem tido sucesso. Quanto à demissão dos funcionários públicos, ela acontece no âmbito de um procedimento administrativo, no qual lhe é atribuída todo o direito à defesa, e finalizado esse procedimento administrativo, se a administração resolve, de fato, pela demissão do funcionário, ainda assim ele tem como recorrer dessa decisão no judiciário. Como eu mostrei anteriormente, o judiciário tem reformado um número muito baixo de decisões administrativas, de maneira que a maioria realmente se mantém. Ou seja, a maioria das demissões se mantém e o funcionário não pode voltar para a administração, porque o judiciário conclui que a decisão administrativa foi a mais acertada.
Gracias. Por favor, Venezuela.
Gracias. Gracias, Camila, por la exposición. Nos llamó la atención en la exposición que identificaron dos figuras. Presumo una está relacionada con el carácter de funcionario de carrera, porque tenían un número de funcionarios despedidos y otros destituidos. Presumo que unos son de carrera y otros no. Y la pregunta en concreto, la destitución o el despido es ordenada por la Contraloría, pero debe ser ejecutada por el órgano o por la máxima autoridad que nombró, o sea, pero no ejecuta directamente la Contraloría, solo lo ordena, igual que en el caso de Venezuela es una accesoria después que el funcionario ha sido declarado responsable, independiente del proceso administrativo sancionatorio para él por el supuesto que dá lugar à destituição.
No Brasil se dá quase na mesma coisa. Existem alguns casos em que a CGU pode avocar o processo, pode chamar para si o processo, e existem os casos em que a gente acaba tendo jurisdição por sermos a autoridade de recurso. Tá? Mas, em sede principal, de fato, cabe a cada um dos seus órgãos proceder com seus respectivos procedimentos administrativos que vão culminar ou não numa decisão de demissão. Aqueles dados são da CGU. São do Executivo Federal. Isso.
Muchas gracias. Uruguay, con las justas.
Justito. No, simplemente, una vez más, coincidir con la solución dada por Brasil en cuanto a la responsabilidad administrativa y no penal, porque este es un tema que a Uruguay le preocupa mucho desde hace bastante tiempo, tanto así que el año pasado organizamos una reunión con motivo de la conmemoración del Día Internacional de la Corrupción, donde concurrió Elizabeth Cosmos para hablar justamente de la parte administrativa, de la responsabilidad administrativa, y la fiscal jefa de la anticorrupción de Chile, la doctora Marta Herrera, para hablar de la parte penal. Es un tema que ya contamos con las dos leyes, creo que Elizabeth me la mandó, la ley de ustedes, y vamos a estar trabajando en eso porque es muy importante. Porque muchas veces se confunde y se habla de responsabilidad penal cuando se pone simplemente una multa administrativa. ¿Por qué se le llama penal a eso? Pero no sería así. Creo que la ley de Brasil la he leído atentamente un par de veces y creo que coincidimos muchísimo en todas esas soluciones, excepto un poquitito en la responsabilidad objetiva, porque tratándose de una sanción, aunque sea de naturaleza administrativa, debería hablarse un poco más de la subjetividad. Ese es un tema que no lo hemos resuelto, mejor dicho, perdón, la Junta de Transparencia, pero sería el único tema en el cual tendríamos alguna discrepancia. Nada, muchas gracias y muchísimas gracias por tu exposición.
Gracias, Uruguay, por compartir también su experiencia. Concluiríamos con esto. También voy a pedir un aplauso a nuestra ponente en este momento. Muchísimas gracias, Camila. Vamos a cerrar entonces con este punto y retornaríamos el día de mañana para... voy a recordarles que tuvimos un cambio en la agenda. Me parece que quizás no todos estábamos aquí. Vamos a iniciar el día de mañana con la consideración y adopción del proyecto de programa de trabajo del Comité para el año 2014 y 2015. Y luego pasaremos directamente a tratar la propuesta de la enmienda al artículo 4 del reglamento. Posteriormente tendremos la elección de presidente y vicepresidente. Como ustedes saben, hasta el momento no tenemos candidaturas a la vicepresidencia. Si es que en este momento existe alguna candidatura, sería más que bien recibida. Caso contrario, parece que vamos a tener que esperar hasta el último minuto para tener esta candidatura. Nos veríamos el día de mañana a las 9 de la mañana. Que tengan una buena tarde y noche.